Hey guys, tonight we begin in a place most history books skip right past. Not Europe, not the Pacific, not the frozen fields outside Stalingrad. Tonight, we're going to the desert. And what if I told you that the United States Army, the same army that would go on to storm the beaches of Normandy, liberate Rome, and accept the unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany? What if I told you that army was, in the winter of 1943, a humiliated, shattered, retreating wreck, beaten so badly by a single German general and his relatively small desert force that senior British officers were quietly asking whether the Americans could be trusted in combat at all? That's where this story begins. Not in triumph, in defeat, in sand and blood, and the particular kind of shame that comes when you realize you are not nearly as good as you thought you were. Chapter 1. The Sand Remembers Everything. Now, let's talk about where we are. Close your eyes for a second, or don't, if you're driving. But picture this. You are standing at the edge of the Sahara. It is July. The time is noon. The temperature on the ground, not in the air, on the actual surface of the sand, is pushing 70 degrees Celsius. That's 158 Fahrenheit. Hot enough to cook an egg. Hot enough to blister skin in under a minute. Hot enough that the metal of a tank's hull becomes, quite literally, a frying pan. Now imagine that you are inside that tank. You and 3 other men. The engine is running. The air smells like diesel and sweat and something else. Something metallic and faintly sweet that the veterans know better than to name. Outside, across the shimmering heat haze, somewhere in the direction of the sun, there are other tanks, and they are not yours. This is North Africa, 1942, and this is where the war, the real war, the war that forged an entirely new kind of American soldier, begins. The North African theater of World War II is one of the most misunderstood chapters in the entire conflict. When people think about the war in Europe, they think in a straight line. Hitler invades Poland. Britain holds on by a thread. America enters after Pearl Harbor. Then D-Day. Then Berlin. Then it's over. But that's not how it actually happened. And the part that gets left out, the long, brutal, transformative chapter in between, is this one. The North African campaign stretched from the spring of 1942 to May of 1943, nearly 2 full years. It stretched across 4,000 miles of coastline from Casablanca in the west all the way to Cairo in the east. It involved the armies of 8 nations. It consumed more than 500,000 casualties on all sides. And it produced, in the end, a surrender so massive it dwarfed anything seen in the European war, to that point larger, in terms of prisoners taken, than even Stalingrad. 275,000 Axis soldiers surrendered in Tunisia in May 1943. Let that number sit for a moment. 275,000, and almost nobody talks about it. Here is what I want you to understand as we go into this story tonight. North Africa wasn't a sideshow. It wasn't a warm-up act. It wasn't the geopolitical equivalent of opening for the main band. It was the crucible. It was the place where the Allied coalition learned slowly, painfully, at enormous human cost, how to fight a modern war, how to coordinate air, land, and sea power, how to supply an army across thousands of miles of hostile terrain, how to take a bureaucratic, peacetime military machine and transform it, in real time, under real fire, into something that could actually win. And it was the place where 2 of the most remarkable military minds of the 20th century found each other across the sand and the smoke and the gun smoke, and played out one of the most extraordinary chess matches in the history of armed conflict. One of them you know, Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, the German field marshal who became so celebrated so mythologized that Winston Churchill stood up in the British Parliament while the war was still being fought and praised him by name as a great general. Churchill's own generals were appalled. His own soldiers were dying at Rommel's hands, and Churchill still said it. Because Rommel, by that point, had become something beyond a soldier. He had become a legend, and legends have a gravitational pull that even enemies can't resist. The other, the man on the Allied side, is someone whose story is perhaps even more interesting because he begins this campaign as an unproven administrator who has never commanded troops in combat, quietly terrified that he is not up to the job. His name is Dwight David Eisenhower, and in the years that follow this campaign, he will become the supreme commander of Allied forces in Europe, the architect of D-Day, and eventually the 34th President of the United States. But in 1942, when this story begins, he is just a general, a worried, sleepless, chain-smoking general who has never heard a shot fired in anger and who is about to find out the very hard way what war actually is. The geography of North Africa shapes everything that happens here, so let's spend a moment with it. Imagine a horizontal strip of land hugging the top of the African continent. To the north, the Mediterranean Sea, blue, ancient, treacherous. To the south, the Sahara, endless, featureless, impassable. Between them, a narrow corridor of coastal scrub, rocky escarpments, and desert valleys that narrows and widens like a breathing thing. This corridor is the battlefield, and it is a battlefield unlike any other in human history. There are no forests to hide in, no cities to use as cover, or very few, and they matter enormously precisely because they are so rare. There are almost no landmarks, no rivers to use as natural defensive lines, nothing to orient yourself by except the sun and the stars and the direction the wind is blowing the sand into your eyes. This creates a kind of warfare that the armies of World War II have never encountered before. It is wide open, it is fast-moving, it rewards boldness and punishes hesitation. It is, and this is the word, the generals themselves kept using fluid. The front lines on any given day could shift by 50 miles in either direction. Entire divisions could be outflanked, cut off, surrounded and destroyed before the commanders at headquarters had finished their morning coffee. It is, in short, the perfect environment for the kind of general Erwin Rommel was, and the absolute worst environment for the kind of army the United States brought with it when it arrived in November 1942. Let me set the stage more precisely. By the time American troops enter the North African theater, the war in the desert has already been raging for 2 years. The British and Commonwealth forces, Australians, South Africans, Indians, New Zealanders, have been fighting Rommel's Afrika Korps since 1941, back and forth across the Libyan and Egyptian desert, like a terrible tide. Rommel advances, the British retreat. The British counterattack, Rommel retreats. Then Rommel attacks again. The British soldiers have a grim name for this cycle. They call it the Benghazi Handicap, named for the Libyan port city that changes hands so many times that the men stop counting. By mid-1942, Rommel has achieved something that seemed impossible. He has pushed the British all the way back to Egypt, all the way back to a tiny, sun-blasted railway halt on the Egyptian coast called El Alamein, barely 60 miles from Alexandria, barely 150 miles from Cairo. If Rommel breaks through at El Alamein, he doesn't just take Egypt. He potentially seizes the Suez Canal, cuts off Britain's supply line to India, and opens a door into the Middle East oil fields that could, this is not an exaggeration, change the entire outcome of the war. Winston Churchill calls it the hinge of fate. He is right. And then, just as Rommel seems unstoppable, 2 things happen. The first is a British general named Bernard Montgomery, who takes command of the 8th Army in August 1942 and promptly refuses to do anything Rommel expects him to do. Montgomery is methodical, where Rommel is intuitive. He is cautious, where Rommel is bold. He is, frankly, not a man who seems built for the lightning warfare of the desert. But he has something Rommel desperately lacks: supplies, men, materiel, and time. The second thing that happens is the Americans. In November 1942, in a massive, risky, logistically staggering operation codenamed Operation Torch, American and British forces land simultaneously on the coasts of Morocco and Algeria, thousands of miles to Rommel's west. The plan: squeeze the Axis forces in North Africa from both ends. Montgomery pushing from the east, the Americans pressing from the west. Rommel caught in between. On paper, it is elegant, clean, a perfect strategic pincer. In practice, it nearly falls apart completely. And the reason it nearly falls apart is the thing that no American military planner wanted to admit, and that every British general had been quietly saying for months. The American army, eager, enthusiastic, well-equipped, and profoundly, catastrophically inexperienced, is not ready for Erwin Rommel, not even close. That reckoning is coming, and when it comes in a place called Kasserine Pass, in February 1943, in a valley in the Tunisian mountains. On a cold, windy day that American military historians will spend the next 80 years arguing about, because what happens there is so comprehensive, so total in its humiliation, that it forces an entire nation to reassess what it thinks it knows about itself. But we'll get there. Tonight, over the next hour and a half or so, we're going to move through this story the way it actually unfolded. Not just the battles, not just the strategy. We're going to go inside the minds of the people who were there. The generals making impossible decisions at 3 a.m. in cold command tents. The tank crews brewing tea in the shadow of their vehicles, not knowing if they'll be alive by noon. The paratroopers jumping out of aircraft in the middle of the night into pitch blackness, over a country they've never seen, toward a landing zone they can only hope is actually there. We're going to meet Erwin Rommel, not the myth, but the man. Exhausted, sick, brilliant, and fighting a battle he knows, somewhere deep down, he cannot win. We're going to meet Dwight Eisenhower, uncertain, overwhelmed, learning in real time what command actually costs, what it means to send men to die for a decision you made. We're going to meet George Patton, who is, even by the standards of this extraordinary cast of characters, something entirely his own, a man out of time. A warrior who seems to have walked directly out of the Napoleonic era and into the middle of the 20th century, somehow making it work. And we're going to spend time with the men who don't have statues, the ones who don't get airports named after them. The tank gunner lying in the sand at Kasserine, with his ears ringing and his crew gone, trying to remember what his sergeant told him to do if this happened. The paratrooper in the Sicilian darkness, separated from his unit, behind enemy lines, making decisions that no amount of training can truly prepare you for. Because ultimately, and this is what I want you to carry with you through this whole story, this is not a tale about generals. It is a tale about what happens when ordinary people are placed inside extraordinary pressure. What breaks, what holds, and what, sometimes, against all reasonable expectation, gets forged into something new. The sand remembers everything. Let's begin. Chapter 2. The Fox in the Desert. There is a story, and I want you to decide for yourself whether it's inspiring or terrifying about Erwin Rommel in the early days of the North African campaign. It is the spring of 1941. Rommel has just arrived in Libya with his Afrika Korps, a relatively small force, sent by Hitler not to win the Desert War, but simply to prop up the collapsing Italian army and prevent a total British victory in North Africa. That's the mission. Hold the line. Don't lose any more ground. Wait for further orders. Rommel reads those orders. He considers them carefully, and then he attacks. Not a small probe, not a cautious advance to test the British defenses. A full, aggressive, fast-moving assault that catches the British Eighth Army completely off guard, sends them reeling backward across hundreds of miles of Libyan desert, and within 2 months, pushes them all the way back to the Egyptian border, a distance that the war in North Africa had been grinding over, back and forth, for more than a year. His superiors in Berlin are stunned. The Italian High Command is furious. Nobody asked him to do this. The British are simply shocked. They had just, weeks earlier, won a stunning victory over the Italians in the same desert. They thought this campaign was essentially over. It was not over. And the reason it was not over, the reason the entire strategic situation in North Africa flipped almost overnight, is the man on whom we are going to spend the next little while tonight. Because to understand this story, you have to understand Rommel. Not the legend, not the myth, though the myth matters enormously, and we'll get to that. The actual man. Where he came from, how he thought, and why. For a long and frightening stretch of this campaign, nobody on the Allied side seemed able to stop him. Erwin Johannes Eugen Rommel was born on November 15, 1891, in Heidenheim, a small town in the Kingdom of Württemberg, in what is now southwestern Germany. He is not, by birth, part of the Prussian military aristocracy that dominates the German officer class. His father is a school teacher. His mother is the daughter of a local government official. They are solid, respectable, middle-class people, not the kind of family that produces legendary field marshals. As a boy, Rommel is slight and pale, and not particularly remarkable. He is interested in mathematics and mechanics. He and a friend, as teenagers, apparently build a working glider in a field near his home. He is methodical, precise, the kind of person who, when he sets his mind to understanding how something works, does not stop until he has pulled it completely apart and put it back together again. This trait, the obsessive, engineering-minded need to understand systems and then exploit their weaknesses, turns out to be the core of his military genius. He joins the German army in 1910 as an officer cadet. He is 19 years old, and in the First World War, he does something that marks him immediately as different from his peers. He wins. Not just wins. He wins in ways that his superiors find difficult to explain within the existing vocabulary of military achievement. In 1917, during the Italian campaign, Rommel leads a force of roughly 600 men in an assault on an Italian position at Mount Matajur in the Dolomites. Over 3 days, moving faster than anyone believed possible, exploiting confusion, attacking from unexpected directions, never allowing the enemy to settle or reorganize, he captures approximately 9,000 Italian soldiers, 9,000 prisoners, with 600 men. He is awarded Germany's highest military honor, the Pour le Mérite. He is 26 years old. What the after-action reports try to capture, and largely fail to, is the specific quality that makes Rommel so extraordinarily dangerous. It is not bravery, though he is unquestionably brave, often recklessly so. It is not intelligence, though he is clearly brilliant. It is something harder to name. The military historian Basil Liddell Hart, who interviews many of Rommel's former subordinates and opponents after the war, eventually settles on a phrase. He calls it the grip of the situation. Rommel, Liddell Hart concludes, has an almost supernatural ability to read a battle as it is actually happening, not as the maps say it should be happening, not as the plan says it should be unfolding, but as it is, in real time, in all its chaos and noise and confusion, and then to act on that reading faster than the enemy can respond. In an era when most generals commanded from well behind the front lines, receiving information hours after events occurred, Making decisions based on maps that were already outdated, Rommel commanded from the front. He was at the point of the spear, constantly. His staff officers had standing orders to assume he was wherever the fighting was heaviest and to look for him there. This is extraordinarily unusual. It is also, as we will see, ultimately one of the things that destroys him. Between the wars, Rommel teaches tactics at the German Military Academy. He writes a book, Infanteriegreifdan. Infantry Attacks, a tactical manual based on his WWI experiences. It becomes a bestseller. Adolf Hitler reads it and is so impressed that he personally requests Rommel's assignment to command his bodyguard unit during the invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1938. This is how Rommel meets Hitler. And this relationship, complicated, useful, ultimately dangerous, will define the rest of his life. When World War II begins in 1939, Rommel commands Hitler's field headquarters during the Polish campaign. He watches the blitzkrieg, the lightning war of tanks, speed, and air power, and he understands it immediately, instinctively, in a way that many senior German officers, trained in the methodical traditions of the Prussian military, do not. He wants a tank command. He lobbies for one. In early 1940, he gets at command of the 7th Panzer Division, heading into France. What follows is one of the most audacious military performances of the entire war. Rommel's 7th Panzer Division moves so fast during the invasion of France that it earns a nickname, the Ghost Division. Because for days at a time, German High Command simply doesn't know where it is. It has outrun communication. It has outrun supply lines. It has, on several occasions, outrun the orders telling it to stop. Rommel doesn't stop. Rommel never stops. When France falls, he is the most celebrated divisional commander in the German army. And then comes the desert. February 1941, Rommel lands in Tripoli, Libya, with the advance units of what will become the Deutsches Afrika Korps, the German Africa Corps. The situation he finds is not good. The Italians, who have been fighting the British in North Africa since 1940, have just been catastrophically defeated. The British General Archibald Wavell, commanding the Western Desert Force, has destroyed an Italian army of over 130,000 men with a force of roughly 30,000. It is one of the most lopsided victories in British military history. Rommel is theoretically here as a supporting act. He has 2 German divisions eventually. Right now, he has barely 1. His Italian allies are demoralized and, frankly, often more concerned with their own survival than with coordinated tactics. His supply lines run across the Mediterranean, under constant threat from the British Royal Navy and Royal Air Force. He is thousands of miles from Germany, in one of the most inhospitable environments on Earth. None of this slows him down in the slightest. Within weeks of arriving, he is doing what he always does, driving forward to see for himself, pressing his commanders to move faster, attacking where the enemy least expects it. His own superiors in Berlin, worried about overextension, send explicit orders to hold his current positions. General Franz Halder, chief of the German General Staff, flies to North Africa specifically to tell Rommel to stop being so aggressive. Rommel nods politely, agrees to be more cautious, and then promptly attacks the next morning. There is a quality to this that goes beyond military confidence. It is, if we're being honest, a kind of magnificent insubordination. Rommel simply believes, not arrogantly, but with a cold engineering certainty, that he can see the battle more clearly than anyone sitting behind a desk in Berlin. And in the early years, he is largely right. The British give him the nickname almost immediately, the Desert Fox. And there is a reason it sticks, a reason it transcends simple press mythology, because it captures something true about how Rommel actually fights. A fox doesn't overpower its prey. It doesn't win through brute strength. It wins through cunning, through speed, through an ability to exploit terrain and timing in ways its opponents don't anticipate. It feints, it doubles back, it attacks from unexpected angles. This is Rommel's tactical DNA. Over and over in the North African campaign, he uses the same basic template: a frontal attack to pin the enemy, a wide flanking maneuver to get around and behind them, speed to prevent them from reacting, and an almost telepathic sense for the moment when an opponent's nerve is cracking, followed by the kind of relentless hammering pressure that ensures they cannot recover. He also does something that sounds almost absurdly simple, but turns out to be devastatingly effective. He uses his anti-tank guns offensively. The British and later the Americans approached tank combat the way it had developed conceptually through the 1930s. Tanks fight tanks. Anti-tank guns defend positions. These are separate tools with separate roles. Rommel ignores this entirely. He uses his famous 88mm anti-aircraft guns, repurposed as anti-tank weapons, as a lure. He sends his tanks forward as bait, drawing the British armor into a charge, then reveals the hidden 88S and lets them destroy the oncoming tanks at long range. By the time the British commanders understand what is happening, they have already lost half their armored strength. He does this repeatedly. The British know it's coming. They fall for it anyway, because Rommel is always moving, always changing the geometry of the battlefield, always finding a new angle. By the time you've identified what he did last time, he's already doing something different. By June 1942, Rommel has achieved something extraordinary. He has taken the fortress city of Tobruk, a place the British have held through siege for 8 months in a single day. 25,000 British and South African troops surrender. It is one of the worst British military disasters of the entire war. Churchill hears the news while he is in Washington, sitting with President Roosevelt. He later writes that it was one of the most shocking moments of his life. Defeat is one thing, he says. Disgrace is another. Hitler promotes Rommel to Field Marshal on the spot. At 49 years old, he is the youngest Field Marshal in the German army. It is an extraordinary moment, and Rommel knows it. In a letter to his wife Lucy, because he writes to her constantly, practically every day, and these letters survive, and they are one of the most remarkable documents of the war. He describes the promotion simply, matter-of-factly, and then immediately writes about how he wishes he had more fuel, more ammunition, more tanks, because Rommel is already thinking about what comes next. What comes next is Egypt. Here is where the story gets complicated. Here is where the legend and the reality begin, carefully and significantly to diverge. Because the Rommel who stands on the Egyptian border in the summer of 1942, staring toward the Nile and Cairo and the Suez Canal, this Rommel is not the same man who arrived in Libya 18 months ago. He is sick, genuinely, physically sick. The desert has done what the British could not. Low blood pressure, chronic stomach and intestinal problems, severe exhaustion that his aides describe in worried private communications as something bordering on collapse. His doctors back in Germany are alarmed. They want him sent home for treatment. He refuses. He is also running out of everything: fuel, ammunition, men. His supply situation, always precarious, has become genuinely critical. Every ton of supplies crossing the Mediterranean runs a gauntlet of British submarines and aircraft operating out of Malta. The casualty rates among Axis supply convoys are staggering. Rommel is fighting a battle of extraordinary brilliance on a logistical shoestring, and he knows it. His own war diary during this period reads like a man slowly, methodically calculating his own doom. And yet, he keeps attacking. Because Rommel has always believed, and it is not an unreasonable belief, given his record, that boldness can substitute for supply, that speed can compensate for shortage, that the enemy's morale, if broken at the right moment, matters more than any calculation of material advantage. He is right about this. Right up until the moment he is catastrophically wrong. The moment he is catastrophically wrong is called El Alamein. But before we get there, before we get to the British general who finally figures out how to stop him, I want to sit with the Rommel of 1942 for just a little longer. Because there is something about him that I find genuinely extraordinary. Something that has nothing to do with tactics or operational art or any of the military vocabulary that surrounds him like a fog. It is the letters. Rommel writes to his wife Lucy almost every single day of the North African campaign, hundreds of letters. And in those letters, between the notes about tactics and the complaints about supplies and the laconic descriptions of battles that shook the earth, there is a man. A full, complicated, achingly human man who misses his wife, worries about his son Manfred, finds the desert landscape genuinely beautiful in a way that disturbs him slightly, and who seems, as the campaign progresses, to be slowly arriving at a conclusion he is not yet ready to voice. He writes, in late 1942, I often ask myself whether it makes sense to go on. Not as a soldier, as a man. There is one more dimension to the Rommel story that we cannot avoid, because it matters to everything that comes after, and it matters to the question of how history judges people who served in deeply unjust systems. Rommel is, by the standards of World War II, a remarkably humane commander. He follows the rules of war. He does not execute prisoners. When he captures Jewish soldiers serving in the British Army, he treats them identically to any other prisoners. When Axis intelligence officers bring him orders to execute captured commandos and Jewish refugees in North Africa, he refuses. He reportedly throws the orders in the trash. He is not a Nazi. He is a German soldier, a distinction that matters, even if it is not always a simple one. He never joins the Nazi Party. He has no involvement in the Holocaust. His son, Manfred Rommel, goes on to become the mayor of Stuttgart and a prominent voice in post-war German democracy. And in 1944, Rommel becomes, quietly, peripherally, but knowingly involved in the conspiracy to assassinate Hitler, not as a planner, but as a name one of the generals the conspirators believe could provide the movement with legitimacy after Hitler is gone. The assassination attempt fails. The conspirators are caught. And Rommel, already weakened by serious injuries sustained in an Allied air attack, is given a choice by Hitler's representatives who arrive at his home. A public trial for treason which would destroy his family, or a private suicide with full military honors and his family protected. He says goodbye to his wife and his son. He gets in the car with the SS officers. He takes the pill they give him. He is 52 years old. It is October 14th, 1944. The state funeral is magnificent. Hitler sends a representative. The German people are told their beloved field marshal died of wounds from the air attack. Lucy Rommel knows the truth. She has always known. She stays quiet until after the war, and then she tells it. And that, I think, is the real Rommel, not the fox, not the myth, not even the brilliant tactician of the desert campaigns that we're going to follow over the next several chapters, but a man who, at the end, had to make the most unbearable calculation any parent can make, and who made it the way he made every other decision in his life, quickly, without flinching, looking straight ahead. The desert gives you clarity, people said who fought there. It strips everything else away. You see people for what they actually are. What the desert shows us about Erwin Rommel is complicated and human and deeply, stubbornly worth understanding. Now, let's talk about the man on the other side. Chapter 3. Eisenhower's Impossible Gamble. On the night of November 7th, 1942, Dwight David Eisenhower is sitting in a cave, not metaphorically, an actual cave. Carved into the rock of the Gibraltar Peninsula, that tiny, improbable finger of British territory jutting off the southern tip of Spain, looking out over the narrow strait where the Atlantic meets the Mediterranean. The cave is cold. It drips. The electric lights strung along the walls cast everything in a yellowish, slightly sickly glow. Outside, barely half a mile away, Spanish territory begins. And Spain, officially neutral but quietly sympathetic to the Axis, is crawling with German intelligence agents who are watching, reporting, trying to piece together what the enormous Allied armada assembling in the Atlantic is actually planning to do. Eisenhower knows they're watching. He knows that everything depends on the next 12 hours. He knows that if the operation fails, if the landings are repulsed, if the weather turns, if the French resist too heavily, if any one of 100 things goes wrong, the consequences will be catastrophic. Not just militarily, politically. The entire Allied coalition, already strained by competing national egos and strategic disagreements, could fracture. He also knows something else, something he has been carrying quietly, privately, for months. He has never heard a shot fired in anger in his life. Dwight Eisenhower is 51 years old in November 1942. He graduated from West Point in 1915, the same class, as it happens, that produces an extraordinary concentration of future generals. A class so decorated that it becomes known as the class the stars fell on. But while his classmates went to France in World War I, Eisenhower stayed home. He commanded a tank training camp in Pennsylvania. He was good at it. Extraordinarily good. Actually, his superiors recognized immediately that he had a gift for organization, for logistics, for the kind of large-scale administrative thinking that most combat officers find unbearably tedious. But he didn't fight. In the years between the wars, he serves in a series of staff positions. He works under General John Pershing, helping to write the official history of the American Expeditionary Forces. He serves under General Douglas MacArthur in the Philippines, a complicated, often frustrating experience that teaches him a great deal about the dangerous intersection of military command and political ego. He is, by the late 1930s, widely regarded as one of the most capable staff officers in the American Army. Brilliant planner, superb administrator, gifted at managing difficult personalities and forging consensus among people who would otherwise be at each other's throats. He has, as of December 7th, 1,941, the day the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor and everything changes, never commanded anything larger than a training battalion in a live exercise. Within 6 months of Pearl Harbor, he is commanding all American forces in Europe. The speed of this rise is breathtaking, and it requires some explanation because it is not what it might look like from the outside. It is not favoritism, exactly. It is not political maneuvering, though Eisenhower is in fact a skilled and subtle political operator, a quality that will prove as important as any military skill in the years ahead. It is, more than anything, a recognition by Army Chief of Staff George Marshall that the war America is about to fight is unlike any war that has come before. Marshall himself, one of the most remarkable figures of the entire conflict, a man whose strategic vision and organizational genius arguably do as much to win the war as any battlefield commander, Marshall understands something crucial. The next war will not be won by the general who is bravest under fire. It will be won by the general who can manage an alliance, who can hold together British and American and French and Canadian and Australian commanders, each with their own national interests, their own military cultures, their own pride, and forge them into a coherent fighting force pointed in the same direction. For that job, Marshall needs someone who is not only strategically brilliant, but temperamentally extraordinary. Someone who can be firm without being domineering, diplomatic without being weak, and decisive without being reckless. Someone who can sit across a table from Winston Churchill, one of the most forceful personalities of the 20th century, and say no, politely but completely, and make it stick. He picks Eisenhower, and then, almost immediately, he throws him into the deep end. The operation Eisenhower is commanding from his dripping cave in Gibraltar has the code name Torch, Operation Torch, and it is, by any reasonable measure, an audacious, genuinely dangerous gamble. The concept is elegant, as the best strategic concepts usually are. Rommel's Afrika Korps is in the east, fighting the British Eighth Army. If the Americans and British can land in the west in Morocco and Algeria, French North African territories under the control of the Vichy French government, they can create a second front. Rommel, caught between two Allied forces closing from opposite directions, will be squeezed, trapped, destroyed. But the execution is a nightmare of complexity. First problem: the French, Morocco and Algeria are not German-occupied territories. They are administered by Vichy France, the collaborationist French government that technically answers to Hitler but maintains a degree of autonomous military force. Roughly 120,000 French troops are stationed in North Africa. They have orders, in the event of any Allied landing, to resist. Will they? The answer is genuinely unknown. Some French officers are secretly pro-Allied, communicating with the Americans through back channels, ready to order their men to stand down. Others are fiercely loyal to Vichy, furious at Britain since the Royal Navy attacked and sank part of the French fleet in 1940 to prevent it falling into German hands. That attack, Operation Catapult, killed over 1,200 French sailors, and the bitterness has not faded. This is where a quiet, meticulous American diplomat named Robert Murphy enters the story. Murphy has been in North Africa for months, cultivating relationships with French military officers, navigating the labyrinthine politics of a divided colonial administration, trying to identify who can be trusted and who cannot. His work, largely invisible in the historical record, rarely given the credit it deserves, is what makes the difference between a landing that triggers a full-scale Franco-American battle and one that doesn't. Murphy calls what he does diplomatic tap dancing. He is not wrong. Second problem: the ocean. To land in Morocco, the American task force has to cross the entire Atlantic, 4,500 miles of open ocean from ports in the United States. This is the largest amphibious operation in American history to that point. Hundreds of ships, tens of thousands of men. All of it has to be coordinated, timed, supplied, and kept secret from German U-boats that are, at this stage of the war, essentially controlling the North Atlantic. The logistical challenge alone is staggering. Eisenhower's staff works around the clock for months. The planning documents for Torch fill an entire room. And throughout all of it, Eisenhower is doing something that his predecessors in the American military tradition had rarely been asked to do. He is constantly, ceaselessly managing the British. Because Torch is a joint operation, American and British forces under American command, which itself is a diplomatic achievement of considerable proportions, given that the British military at this point has years of combat experience that the Americans entirely lack. The British generals are, with some exceptions, politely but clearly skeptical of their American counterparts. They have been fighting since 1939. They have been humiliated at Dunkirk, at Singapore, at Tobruk. They have learned things, the hard way, that no training exercise can teach. And now, they are expected to take orders from an American general who has never seen combat. Eisenhower is aware of this. He is exquisitely, painfully aware of it. His diary during this period is a remarkable document filled with frustration, self-doubt, and a kind of dogged, almost stubborn determination to prove himself. He writes, in September 1942, that he feels like a man trying to conduct an orchestra in which every musician is playing a different piece of music and several of them are actively trying to take the baton. Third problem, the plan itself. Operation Torch involves 3 simultaneous landings. The Western Task Force, entirely American, commanded by George Patton, more on him later, much more lands near Casablanca on the Atlantic coast of Morocco. The Center Task Force, also largely American, lands near Oran in western Algeria. The Eastern Task Force, mostly British with some Americans, lands near Algiers, further east. 3 landings, 3 task forces, hundreds of ships, thousands of miles of coastline, all timed to go simultaneously, in the dark, against defenders whose response is unknown. The night before the landings, Eisenhower sits in Gibraltar and waits. His naval aide, Captain Harry Butcher, keeps a diary later published that describes Eisenhower during this period with uncomfortable vividness. He chain smokes. He paces. He is, Butcher writes, as close to scared as I've ever seen a senior officer allow himself to appear. He drinks coffee constantly and sleeps almost not at all. At one point, alone in a small side room, he flips a coin over and over, 50 times. He counts the results. Later, when asked why, he says he needed something to do with his hands. Something that reminded him that outcomes are sometimes beyond the reach of calculation. Heads or tails. Plan and prepare as thoroughly as humanly possible, and then at some point you flip the coin and you wait. November 8th, 1942, the landings begin. And here is the thing about Operation Torch that tends to get lost in later tellings of the story, because later events so dramatically overshadow it. It works. Not perfectly. Nothing in war works perfectly. There is fighting at Oran that is bloodier than anyone hoped. Patton's forces at Casablanca face stiffer French resistance than expected, and the naval battle offshore is violent and costly. There are navigation errors, units landing on the wrong beaches, soldiers discovering that the training exercises they completed in the cold English countryside have not entirely prepared them for the particular chaos of an actual opposed amphibious landing. But within 3 days, it is over. The French commanders, after some intense diplomatic pressure from Murphy and others, and after the senior French commander in North Africa, Admiral François Darlan, makes a fateful decision to cooperate, order their troops to cease fire. The Vichy French forces in North Africa stand down. The Americans are ashore. The western door into North Africa is open. Eisenhower gets the news in Gibraltar. Butcher, watching him, says it is the only time in the entire campaign he sees Eisenhower look, just for a moment, like he might actually allow himself to feel relief. The moment lasts about 90 seconds. Then Eisenhower is back at the maps, because the next problem is already here. The next problem is Tunisia. The plan, the elegant, squeeze Rommel from both sides plan, depends on speed. The Allies need to push east from their landing zones into Tunisia before the Germans can reinforce it. If they can seize Tunisia quickly, Rommel is trapped. If they can't, if the Germans get there first and establish a defensive line in the Tunisian mountains, the campaign becomes a very different and much more difficult proposition. They don't get there first. Hitler, to his credit as a military strategist and to the considerable misfortune of the Allies, reacts to Torch with unusual speed and decision. Within days of the Allied landings, he begins pouring troops and supplies into Tunisia through the ports of Tunis and Bizerte. By the time the Allied advance guard reaches the Tunisian border, they find to their dismay that significant German forces are already dug in, holding the mountain passes, and are not inclined to move. The race for Tunisia is lost. The campaign that everyone hoped would last weeks will last months. The elegant strategic concept is now a grinding, attritional campaign through difficult mountain terrain in winter, against an enemy who has had time to prepare. And the American troops who are going to have to fight that campaign are about to encounter something that no amount of planning or preparation has truly readied them for. They are going to encounter the German army at full pitch, experienced, professional, utterly ruthless, commanded at its sharp end by officers who have been fighting this war since 1939, officers who have developed instincts and reflexes and tactical habits that can only be acquired through years of actual combat. And on the American side, brave, willing, enthusiastic, equipped with some of the best material in the world, are soldiers who, for all their training, for all their equipment, for all the organizational genius of the army that sent them here, are fighting in combat for the very first time. Eisenhower knows this. He knows the gap is real, and in the weeks after Torch, as the front in Tunisia slowly stabilizes and the German defenses harden, he is doing something that his position and his ego should, perhaps, make difficult. He is learning, rapidly, painfully, sometimes publicly. He makes mistakes, several significant ones. He is slow to relieve ineffective commanders, partly because he dislikes confrontation, and partly because he is not yet certain enough in his own combat judgment to be confident he is right. He is sometimes too deferential to the British, sometimes not deferential enough. He struggles with the fundamental tension at the heart of his command, the need to be both a military commander and a political diplomat, making decisions that are militarily sound and politically sustainable simultaneously. His deputy, the British General Harold Alexander, is quietly skeptical. The British Chiefs of Staff in London have serious private doubts about whether Eisenhower is up to this. There are conversations in back rooms about whether a more experienced commander should take over. Eisenhower is aware of these conversations. He doesn't know their precise content, but he knows they're happening. You don't rise as fast as he has without developing a very accurate antenna for the political weather around you. He keeps going, head down, learning. There is a moment in these early weeks of the Tunisian campaign that I want to leave you with before we move forward into the darkness of what's coming. Eisenhower visits the front. He goes to see the American troops, young men, most of them barely out of their teens, sitting in foxholes in the cold Tunisian mud, waiting. He moves through their positions, talking to them, looking at their equipment, asking questions of their officers, and he comes back to his headquarters in Algiers, quieter than when he left. His aide asks him what he saw, what he thought. He is quiet for a long moment. Then he says something that his aide writes down, because it strikes him as the most honest thing Eisenhower has said since they arrived in North Africa. He says, "They're good boys. They want to do right, but wanting isn't enough. And we don't have much time before they find that out." He is right. They don't have much time. In a mountain pass in central Tunisia, in February 1943, they are about to find it out in the most brutal way possible. The pass is called Kasserine. And what happens there will force a reckoning with strategy, with leadership, with the basic American self-image of military competence that echoes through the rest of the war, and, in some ways, through American military thinking right up to the present day. Rommel is coming. Chapter 4. The Kasserine Catastrophe. Let me tell you what Kasserine Pass looks like. It is a gap in the dorsal mountains of central Tunisia. The mountains here are not dramatic in the way that Alps are dramatic, not soaring, not snow-capped, not the kind of landscape that makes you reach for your camera. They are brown and rocky and hard, folded into each other like crumpled paper, cut through by valleys that funnel wind and rain and, in February, a cold that gets into your bones in a way that the soldiers, most of them from the American South and Midwest, most of them having never left their home states before the army took them, are not prepared for. The pass itself is about 2 miles wide at its narrowest point. On either side, the rocky ridgelines rise sharply. In the center, a dry riverbed cuts through the valley floor, flanked by scrub brush and the occasional cluster of cactus. There is a small village nearby, a handful of stone buildings. A road that runs through the pass and connects the coastal plain to the west with the interior plateau to the east. A road that, if you control it, gives you access to the Allied supply depots at Tebessa, to the rail junction at Thala, to the entire logistical backbone of the Allied position in Tunisia. This is what Rommel wants. This is what the American soldiers in the pass are supposed to prevent him from taking. On the morning of February 19th, 1943, those American soldiers, the men of the U.S., two corps, green and cold, and not yet knowing what is about to happen to them, are about to have the worst 2 days in the history of the United States Army in the Second World War. To understand Kasserine, you have to back up about a week. February 14th, 1943, Valentine's Day. A date that the American soldiers who survive it will remember with a particular bitter irony for the rest of their lives. The Germans strike first, not at Kasserine, but at a place called Sidi Bouzid, a small settlement on the eastern edge of the Tunisian plain, where American armor is positioned in a way that, to an experienced eye, is deeply vulnerable. The units are dispersed. The defensive positions are not mutually supporting. The commanders are not entirely clear on what the units to their left and right are doing. There are gaps in communication, gaps in coordination, gaps in the basic shared tactical awareness that experienced armies develop over years of fighting together and that the Americans, here and now, simply do not yet have. The German attack is led by the 10th and 21st Panzer divisions, and it is textbook Rommel, a frontal attack to pin the Americans in place, combined with a wide flanking movement that slides around their southern flank before the American commanders even realize what is happening. Within hours, American tank battalions that were supposed to be defending the plain are suddenly finding German armor appearing behind them, between them and their retreat routes, cutting them off. The response from American headquarters is confused, then desperate. A relief column is sent forward, the 1st Armored Division's Combat Command C, pushing east to relieve the trapped units. It drives directly into a prepared German ambush. The 88mm guns that the Americans know about and somehow keep being surprised by open up at long range. American tanks burn. American crews die or bail out into the scrub and start walking west toward their own lines, sometimes under fire. By the end of February 14th, the Americans have lost over 100 tanks, nearly 1,400 men killed, wounded, or captured. An entire armored battalion, Combat Command A, is effectively destroyed as a fighting force. It is the worst single day for American armor in the entire war. And it is only the beginning. Erwin Rommel watches the reports come in from his command vehicle, a captured British ACV, an armored command vehicle. Because Rommel has always had an appreciation for good equipment, regardless of its national origin, and he feels something he has not felt in months. Possibility. He is sick. His stomach is wrecked. His blood pressure is dangerously low. His doctors are practically begging him to go home. He has been fighting this campaign for nearly 2 years, and the exhaustion has settled into him at a cellular level, the kind of tired that sleep no longer fixes. But the reports from Sidi Bouzid light something up in him that the exhaustion cannot quite reach, because he sees, in the American response, exactly what he has been looking for, not just tactical errors. Something deeper, an institutional inexperience, a fundamental unfamiliarity with the rhythm and tempo of modern armored warfare that tells him the Americans are not yet able to respond to what he can do at the speed at which he can do it. He has a plan, a bold one. His superiors, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commanding Axis forces in the Mediterranean, and General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, commanding the German forces in northern Tunisia, have their own ideas about what should happen next. And those ideas are more cautious, more limited. They want to consolidate the gains at Sidi Bouzid. Wait, see what the Americans do. Rommel does not want to wait. He argues, forcefully, for a massive westward thrust through Kasserine Pass, past Tebessa, all the way to the Allied supply base at Le Kef. A drive deep into the Allied rear that could, if it succeeds, not merely push the Americans back, but potentially collapse the entire Allied position in Tunisia, force them to the coast. Buy time for the Axis forces to consolidate, and perhaps survive long enough for the strategic situation to shift. He gets a partial approval, not the full scope of what he wanted, but enough. On February 19th, the panzers turn toward Kasserine. The American positions at the pass are held by a mixture of units, infantry, engineers, artillery, tank destroyers, thrown together in the hurried, improvised way that characterizes a defense being assembled under pressure. The men are not cowards. I want to be absolutely clear about this, because what happens next is sometimes told in a way that implies they are. They are not. They are inexperienced. They are poorly coordinated. Their officers, in many cases, are operating on plans that don't account for the speed and violence of what's coming. And they are about to be hit by something that no training, no field exercise, no amount of preparation can fully simulate. The German attack on Kasserine Pass begins before dawn on February 19th with artillery. Then, infantry probing the American positions, feeling for weaknesses, drawing fire to reveal where the defenders are and how many. Then armor, pushing up the valley floor, using the terrain features the dry riverbed, the brush, the rocky outcroppings as cover. The American artillery fires. The tank destroyers engage. For the first hours, the pass holds. Then something happens that happens in battle, and almost never in training: the noise. Veterans talk about this. The soldiers who were at Kasserine talk about this in their memoirs, in interviews, in letters home that take weeks to arrive, and are sometimes the last letters they ever write. The noise of a full German armored assault is not like anything you have experienced or can imagine. The tank engine's deep, grinding, mechanical thunder. The artillery, incoming and outgoing, overlapping until it becomes a single, continuous physical force that you feel in your chest, your teeth, your vision, the machine guns, the anti-tank rounds. The screaming, and it is not dramatic, Hollywood screaming, it is functional screaming. Men calling to each other because speech is impossible, and they are trying to communicate, and there is no other way. Private soldiers in their first real combat, men who have been preparing for this moment for months, discover, in the span of about 15 minutes, that preparation and reality are separated by a gap that cannot be crossed in any way except by crossing it. Some of them hold, some of them break. Some of them do things they will spend the rest of their lives trying to understand, acts of extraordinary courage, or paralysis, or confusion, or the strange calm that sometimes descends on people when the situation becomes so overwhelming that something in the brain simply decides to stop being afraid and start functioning. By the afternoon of February 19th, the pass is breached. German armor pours through. The American units on the ridgelines, now outflanked, begin to fall back. Some retreat in order. Others simply, and this is the word used in the after-action reports, without judgment, because it is accurate run. The retreat becomes a rout. American vehicles clog the roads heading west. Trucks, jeeps, half-tracks, ambulances, all moving away from the pass in a stream that the German reconnaissance aircraft, flying overhead, photograph and report back to Rommel's headquarters. Equipment is abandoned. Supplies are left where they sit. One American unit, finding the road blocked, drives their vehicles into the desert and simply starts walking. The Germans follow, pushing west, then northwest, their advance columns probing for the weak points in the Allied rear, looking for the road to Tebessa, to Thala, to everything that lies open and largely undefended in the Allied rear. At Allied headquarters, the situation maps are being updated faster than the commanders can process them. The two-corps commander, Major General Lloyd Fredendall, who runs his headquarters from a bomb-proof bunker 60 miles behind the front, who rarely if ever visits his forward units, who communicates in an idiosyncratic, coded language that his own subordinate commanders sometimes cannot decipher. Fredendall is receiving reports that paint a picture of progressive collapse. He calls Eisenhower's headquarters. The conversation, reconstructed from contemporary accounts, is not a good one. Eisenhower receives the news from Tunisia with something that one of his aides describes carefully as controlled anguish. He does not shout. He does not blame. He begins making calls. Moving reserves, trying to find units that can be repositioned to block the German advance before it reaches something truly critical. He also gets in a car and drives toward the front. This matters. This act of physically going forward, of seeing it with his own eyes, of putting himself where the reality is, rather than where the maps say. The reality is, this is one of the things that Eisenhower does right in a week, in which many things go wrong. Because what he sees at the front tells him things that no report could. He sees the faces of the men coming back. He sees the abandoned equipment. He sees the particular quality of exhaustion and confusion and shaken confidence that lives in the eyes of soldiers who have just discovered that everything they thought they knew about war was not enough. He also sees something else, something that the disaster reports do not capture, and that matters enormously for what comes next. He sees men stopping, reforming, finding officers, sometimes their own, sometimes whoever is available, and turning around. Not many at first, but some, and then more. The American soldier, he writes in his diary that night, is not broken. He is shocked. He is shaken. He is, in many cases, badly led. But he is not broken. The difference, Eisenhower understands with sudden, cold clarity, is not the soldier, it is the leadership. Rommel's advance, meanwhile, is beginning to run into its own problems. He pushes northwest from Kasserine toward Thala, one of the two main roads he needs to threaten the Allied rear effectively. And at Thala, on February 21st, he encounters something unexpected. A scratch force of British and American units, hastily assembled, dug in on the road north of the town. They are outnumbered. Their equipment is a patchwork. Their commanders are improvising in real time. They hold. Not comfortably, not easily, with considerable loss, but they hold. Simultaneously, to the south, another German thrust toward Tebessa runs into American artillery and infantry that, having had a day to collect themselves, fight with a ferocity that surprises the German commanders. The roads through the mountains, which looked so open on the map, turn out to be easily blocked by determined defenders with artillery. And Rommel, who has been fighting this campaign on an empty fuel tank for months, is running out of time. His supply situation, always critical, is becoming catastrophic. The fuel he needs to sustain the advance is not coming through. His ammunition is dwindling. The mountain roads that seemed like pathways to a decisive breakthrough are turning into a logistical nightmare. And the Allied air forces, which have been absent or ineffective for much of the Kasserine battle, are beginning to find their rhythm, striking the German supply columns, making daylight movement increasingly costly. On February 22nd, Rommel makes the decision. He orders the withdrawal. The Battle of Kasserine Pass is over. The final accounting is grim from the American side. Over 6,500 American casualties in a week of fighting, killed, wounded, captured, missing. Nearly 200 tanks destroyed or abandoned. Hundreds of other vehicles lost. An entire division badly mauled, its confidence shattered, its organization disrupted. The German advance has been stopped, yes, but it has been stopped by geography and logistics as much as by American fighting power, and everyone on the Allied side knows it. The recriminations begin immediately. Who is responsible? The soldiers? The training? The tactics? The commanders? The answer, as Eisenhower understands even before the shooting stops, is all of the above, and none of the above. The truth of Kasserine is more uncomfortable than any single scapegoat can contain. The truth is that the American Army, in February 1943, was not yet good enough to fight the German Army at this level of intensity. Not the soldiers, the system. The training was inadequate in specific and identifiable ways. The tactics were wrong. The command culture was broken in ways that had been visible for months to anyone willing to look. The question now is not who is to blame. The question is, what happens next? Hans von Luck, a colonel in the Afrika Corps who fights at Kasserine and later writes one of the most honest and clear-eyed memoirs of the North African campaign, describes the American soldiers he encounters in this period with a specific kind of respect that I find striking. He writes that they are brave, genuinely, instinctively brave, in a way that he has not encountered in other armies. But they are fighting, he says, like a gifted musician who has never performed in front of an audience. All the technique is there, but technique without experience is not yet mastery. He is right, and the American Army is about to start getting its experience. It starts with a phone call, a reassignment, a general being relieved of his command and another one being sent in his place. The new man flies into Tunisia on March 6, 1943. He arrives wearing 2 pearl-handled revolvers. He gets off the aircraft and looks around at the scene before him, the dust, the chaos, the demoralized faces of soldiers who have spent 3 weeks convincing themselves that maybe the Germans really are unbeatable, and he says something to his aide that will later be reported in slightly different versions by everyone who claims to have heard it. The version I believe, because it sounds the most like him, is this: "We're going to kick the living hell out of them, and then we're going to do it again." His name is George Smith Patton, Jr. And North Africa, the North Africa that has been killing Americans and shattering units and humiliating the Allied command for 3 months, is about to meet someone it has never encountered before. Chapter 5. Blood in the Sand. I want to stop the generals for a moment. We will get back to them. Patton is coming, and believe me, Patton is worth waiting for. Montgomery is still out there in the eastern desert, fighting his own version of this war. Rommel is retreating, exhausted and sick, but not finished. The grand strategic story has more chapters still to run, but right now, I want to go somewhere else. I want to go down. Down from the headquarters, down from the command tents and the situation maps and the telephone cables and the staff officers arguing over supply allocations at 2 in the morning. Down from all of that, all the way down to the ground, to the sand, to the place where the war is not a concept or a strategy or a problem to be solved, but simply and terribly the next 5 minutes. Because here is the thing about the way we usually tell the story of World War II. We tell it from above. We tell it in terms of armies and corps and divisions and the men who commanded them. We tell it in kilometers gained and objectives taken and casualty figures that, by the time they reach a number like 6,000, have become almost without our noticing abstractions, statistics, data points on a chart. And in doing that, in telling it that way, we lose something irreplaceable. We lose the texture of it, the smell and the sound and the particular quality of fear and courage that exists only at the level of the individual human being, in the individual moment, when the individual choice has to be made. So tonight, for a little while, we go down. His name is Jack Logan. He is 22 years old. He is from a small town in rural Georgia, the second of 4 children, the son of a man who fixes cars for a living and a mother who teaches Sunday school and makes the best peach pie in 3 counties. Or so Jack has always believed. He has been in the army for 14 months. He has been in North Africa for 3. He is a tank gunner, specifically, which means he sits in the right side of the turret of an M4 Sherman tank and operates the main gun. He is good at it. His commander, a sergeant named Briggs, who is 26, and seems ancient in the way that 26 can seem ancient when you are 22, and both of you are in a tank in the Tunisian desert, has told him more than once that he has the best eye in the company. Jack is proud of this. He tries not to show it. On the morning of February 14th, 1943 Valentine's Day, which he will never be able to think about again without a cold feeling in his chest, Jack is in his tank, engine idling, waiting for orders that keep changing and then changing back. The tank smells like diesel and metal and the particular sour smell of 4 men who have been living in a steel box for 3 days without a proper wash. Outside, the temperature is already climbing. By noon, it will be hot enough that the hull will be painful to touch with bare skin. Inside the tank, even with the hatches open, it will be worse. The radio crackles. Orders come through. They are moving east towards Sidi Bouzid. The Germans have been reported in the area. They are going to push them back. Nobody in Jack's tank says anything for a moment. Then Briggs, up in the commander's hatch, says something that Jack will remember for the rest of his life. Not because it is wise or profound, but because of how completely ordinary it is. He says, "Well, let's go see what all the fuss is about." The thing they don't tell you about tank combat, the thing that no training exercise, no matter how realistic, can reproduce, is the sensory overload of it. You are inside a steel box. The engine is running, and the engine of an M4 Sherman is loud, a 400 horsepower radial aircraft engine, roaring, and on top of that, there is the sound of the tracks, the grinding mechanical complexity of the tank in motion, the radio traffic, and then, when the shooting starts, something that Jack will later describe to his brother in a letter that takes 6 weeks to arrive, as like being inside a church bell when someone hits it. The first German round hits the tank to Jack's left. Not his tank, the one 30 yards away, named Geraldine after its commander's girlfriend back in Mississippi. He sees it happen from the vision port. One moment, Geraldine is moving forward, turret traversing, looking for a target. Then there is a sound that is more physical sensation than sound, a crack and a thump that Jack feels in his sternum, and Geraldine stops. Just stops. The way a living thing stops when it is suddenly not living. He sees one hatch open. One man gets out. Just one. He doesn't have time to think about this. Briggs is shouting bearing and range, and Jack's hands are already moving traverse left, elevation, acquire the target. The German tank is hull down behind a rise, only the turret visible, and Jack is calculating the range by eye, the way Briggs has drilled into him for months. And he fires. He misses. He adjusts. He fires again. He hits. He doesn't know what happens to the crew of the German tank. He will think about this sometimes, years later, and then he will stop thinking about it. The Battle of Sidi Bouzid, for Jack's company, lasts about 4 hours. At the end of those 4 hours, his company 12 tanks has 3 left. Jack's is one of them. Briggs is alive. The loader, a 19-year-old named Kowalski from Pittsburgh, who has a photograph of his mother taped above his station, is alive. The driver, Martinez, who can make the Sherman do things its designers probably didn't intend, is alive. They are falling back. Everyone is falling back. The order has come through retreat. Fall back to the western side of the pass. regroup, and the 3 surviving tanks of Jack's company are doing exactly that. Moving as fast as a Sherman can move on the rough ground, which is not very fast, which is one of the Sherman's notable disadvantages against the German Panzers, a disadvantage that the American soldiers who drive and crew and die in these tanks are intimately, bitterly aware of. Jack does not feel fear during the retreat. He will find this puzzling later. He thinks he should feel fear, and he does not. What he feels is a very specific, very focused kind of attention, as if all the bandwidth of his consciousness has been redirected from everything else toward the single task of staying alive in the next 60 seconds. What he will later come to understand, though he won't have the words for it until long after the war, is that this is not the absence of fear. It is what fear becomes when there is no room for it to be anything else. The nights in the Tunisian desert, in February, are cold. Not the dramatic cold of a snowstorm or a blizzard. A penetrating, sneaking cold that gets under your blanket and into your joints and makes everything sleeping, thinking, staying on watch, doing anything except shivering an act of conscious effort. The soldiers wrap themselves in whatever they have. Blankets, extra uniform layers, the canvas tarps from the equipment. They sleep in shifts. 2 hours on, 2 hours off. Sometimes less, if the situation is uncertain, which the situation almost always is. Jack writes a letter during one of these nights, by the light of a flashlight held under a blanket so it won't be visible from outside. He writes to his mother. He tells her he is well. He tells her the food is acceptable and the weather is fine, both of which are not quite true, but are the kinds of not quite truths that a 22-year-old boy writes to his mother from a war zone when he doesn't want her to spend every night sitting up at the kitchen table, worrying. Then he writes, "I saw some things today that I am going to think about for a long time. I don't know yet what I think about them. Maybe I'll figure it out when I get home. Save the peach pie." He folds the letter. He puts it in his pocket. In the morning, he will find a mail drop and hand it over, and it will travel by jeep and truck and ship and more truck, across the Atlantic and up the eastern seaboard and down to Georgia, arriving weeks later, and his mother will read it at the kitchen table in the morning light and not quite understand what he is saying, and be frightened by that, by the gap between what she can understand and what he has seen, in a way that she will carry with her for years. This gap, this particular unbridgeable distance between the person who was there and the person who was not, is one of the quiet casualties of every war. It doesn't show up in the casualty figures, but it is real. Now let's go somewhere else entirely. Let's go up, not to the command tent, higher than that, 3,500 feet above the Sicilian coast, in the dark belly of a C-47 transport aircraft, moving at 150 miles per hour through turbulence that has been throwing the plane around for the last 40 minutes. The red light above the jump door is on, which means stand up and get ready. His name is Jesse Adams. He is a sergeant in the 82nd Airborne Division. He is 24 years old, originally from a small town in Tennessee, and he has been jumping out of perfectly functional aircraft for 18 months. He is good at it. He is good at most things the Army asks him to do, which is part of why he is a sergeant and part of why he is here. On this plane, on the night of July 9th, 1943, as the largest airborne operation in American history, to that point begins to unfold over the coast of Sicily. Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily, and Jesse Adams and his stick of 15 paratroopers are about to become part of it. He checks his equipment for the 4th time in the last 20 minutes. Static line, reserve chute, main chute, rifle, ammunition, grenades, knife, compass, map, a map that he has memorized so thoroughly that he could draw it from memory in the dark, which, given the circumstances, is not an entirely hypothetical skill. He checks the man in front of him. He checks the man behind. Everyone is ready. Nobody is calm. The problem with the Sicily airborne operation, a problem that the men on the planes do not yet know the full extent of, is the wind. A strong sirocco, blowing in off the North African desert, has picked up over the previous 24 hours. By jump time, winds at altitude are gusting to 35 miles per hour. The C-47S, already struggling with navigation in the dark, no GPS, obviously, limited radio navigation, relying on the pilot's skill and the navigator's calculations, are being pushed off course. Units that are supposed to land together are being scattered. Drop zones that were planned with precision are shifting. And some of the pilots, young men, many of them, flying their first combat mission, threading through the anti-aircraft fire that is beginning to stitch upward from the ground are, simply and understandably, not hitting their marks. Jesse knows none of this. He knows the red light. He knows the plane is moving. He knows, from the roughness of the flight, that the wind is wrong. But how wrong, how far from where they are supposed to be they actually are, this he does not know. The light changes. Green. He goes. The exit from the aircraft is always the same and always different. The blast of air hits you like a wall at 150 miles per hour. The wind is physical, a thing with mass and intention, grabbing at your equipment, snapping your head back. Then, the static line pulls the chute, and there is a sharp, violent jerk as the canopy opens and the roaring rush of the aircraft's passage fades, and you are suddenly, shockingly, in silence. Or near silence. The guns are firing below. Tracers are moving through the dark sky in long, lazy arcs that are not actually lazy at all. They just look that way because of the scale. Because each tracer represents a round moving at hundreds of feet per second, and the laziness is an optical illusion produced by distance. Jesse knows this. He has been told this. He knows that what looks like a slow red line is actually a thing that will kill him if it hits him. He looks down. He can see the coastline, the white line of surf, the darker mass of land, some fires burning inland that he cannot identify. He cannot identify his landing zone. The terrain below him does not match the map he has memorized. This is, in the dry language of the operational report that will be written later, a navigational discrepancy. In the immediate physical reality of Jesse Adams at 2,000 feet above Sicily in the dark, it means something simpler. He does not know where he is. He lands hard. Rougher terrain than the drop zone was supposed to offer rocky ground, not the agricultural fields marked on the map. He rolls, absorbs the impact the way he has been trained to, unhooks his chute quickly. The muscle memory of 18 months doing the work, while his eyes and ears are doing something else, scanning, listening. Silence. Or not silence, the distant sound of guns, aircraft engines fading, wind in the scrub, but no immediate threat, no voices, no movement. He is alone. This is the nightmare scenario of airborne operations, the dispersal, the isolation. You train as a unit. Your effectiveness, your firepower, your ability to accomplish the mission depends on operating as a unit, and then the wind and the dark and the imprecision of night navigation strip the unit away from you, and you are just a man, alone, on the ground, in enemy territory, with a rifle and a map that may not tell you where you are. Jesse does what he has been trained to do. He moves to cover a stone wall running along the edge of a field. He waits. He listens. He pulls out his compass and his map, and he begins, methodically and quietly, to try to figure out where he is. He also does something that is not in the training manual, and that he will not be able to explain clearly when he talks about it later. He breathes, slowly and deliberately. 4 counts in, 4 counts out. The way his father taught him to breathe when he was anxious as a boy, his father who is a farmer in Tennessee and who is probably asleep right now, or lying awake listening to the radio, trying to get news from Europe. 4 counts in, 4 counts out. He is still alive. He knows where his rifle is. He will figure out the rest. The war correspondent, Ernie Pyle, is in North Africa and then Sicily during this period, moving with the troops, sleeping where they sleep, eating what they eat, filing dispatches that run in newspapers across the United States and are read by millions of people who are trying to understand what the men they sent to war are actually experiencing. Pyle is one of the great war correspondents in history, not because he explains strategy or analyzes command decisions or provides the kind of context that a historian or a military analyst provides. He is great because he simply, and the simplicity is the genius, tells you who the soldiers are. He writes, from Tunisia in early 1943, the outstanding trait in American soldiers is their almost constant good humor. They gripe and complain and cuss. But underneath there is a fundamental goodness, a patience, an endurance, and a belief that things will eventually be all right that I find remarkable considering what they are being asked to endure. And then, in a line that I have thought about often since I first read it, they are not heroes. They are not statues waiting to be made. They are just boys doing the hardest thing anybody has ever asked them to do, and mostly doing it without anyone watching, and mostly doing it well. Jack Logan, the tank gunner from Georgia, survives North Africa. He fights in Tunisia and then in Sicily. He is wounded once, a fragment from an artillery round that takes a piece out of his left forearm and leaves a scar that he will show his children years later when they ask what the war was like, because the scar is easier to show them than the answer. He ends the war as a staff sergeant. He goes home to Georgia. He works in his father's garage. He marries a woman named Clara who makes a decent peach pie, but, he admits cheerfully, not quite as good as his mother's. He doesn't talk much about the war, not because it haunts him or not only because of that, but because, he says once to his son when his son is old enough to ask, the war happened to a different person. A 22-year-old boy who no longer exists, who was burned away in the heat and the noise and the sand of a desert most people back home couldn't find on a map. That boy did all right, he says. I'm proud of him, but I'm glad I'm not him anymore. Jesse Adams, the paratrooper from Tennessee, finds 3 men from his company before dawn on the morning of July 10th in Sicily. By noon, he has found 11 more. By the end of the day, the fragment of his unit is fighting as a unit again, hitting German positions, cutting roads, doing the things paratroopers are supposed to do, a long way from anywhere anyone planned for them to be. But doing them, he fights in Sicily and then in Italy. He makes it home. He becomes a school teacher. He coaches football. He never talks about the night jump over Sicily, not once, to anyone, for the rest of his life. Some things, he has decided, belong to the dark, and the dark can keep them. Chapter 6. Patton arrives. There is a story about George Patton that his aide, Colonel Charles Codman, tells after the war. It is March 1943. Patton has just arrived at 2 Corps' headquarters in Jebel Kouif, Tunisia, to take command of the shattered, demoralized American force that has just spent 3 weeks being systematically humiliated by Rommel's Afrika Korps. The headquarters itself is a collection of tents and vehicles half buried in the side of a hill chosen for concealment from German aircraft, which is sensible and organized with a casualness that Patton finds immediately and viscerally offensive. He gets out of his vehicle. He is wearing his helmet lacquered, with 3 stars on it. His boots are polished to a mirror shine despite the fact that he has just driven for hours across dusty Tunisian roads. The pearl-handled revolver's actually ivory. He always corrects people, because real pearl is for pirates, are on his hips. He is 60 years old, and he looks, Codman writes, like something that has been waiting in a museum for the right war to come along and give it a reason to exist. He looks around at the headquarters, at the soldiers moving without urgency, at the vehicles not properly camouflaged, at the general atmosphere of an institution that has recently had its confidence broken and has not yet found a reason to rebuild it. He stands there for about 15 seconds, taking it in. Then he turns to Codman and says, quietly, and the quiet is important, because Patton is not always loud. He is strategic about volume, the way a musician is strategic about dynamics, he says. This is a mess. We're going to fix it, starting right now. And then George Smith Patton Jr. begins one of the most remarkable institutional transformations in the history of the American military. To understand what Patton does in Tunisia, you first need to understand who Patton is. Because Patton is one of those figures who has been so thoroughly mythologized by Hollywood, by hagiographic biography, by the man himself, who was a dedicated and sometimes exhausting self-mythologizer, that the real person can be difficult to find underneath all the theater. The theater is real, don't misunderstand me. The revolvers are real, the profanity is real, the theatricality is conscious and deliberate and calculated, and we will get to why it works. But there is a man underneath the theater, and the man is considerably more interesting and considerably more complex than the myth. George Smith Patton Jr. is born in 1,885 inches, San Gabriel, California, into a family with a deep military tradition. His grandfather, a Virginia Military Institute graduate, died commanding Confederate troops in the Civil War. His family grows up around the stories, the battles, the sacrifices, the particular romance that the American South constructs around its military defeats. Patton absorbs this the way a child absorbs language, effortlessly, completely, without choosing to. He believes, genuinely and without irony, that he has lived before, that he is the reincarnation of a series of warriors stretching back through history, a Roman legionary, a Napoleonic cavalry officer, a medieval knight. He writes poetry about this. Serious poetry, not comic verse. Whatever you think about the metaphysics of this belief, it tells you something important about how Patton understands himself. He does not experience himself as a 20th century American military officer who happens to be good at his job. He experiences himself as a warrior, in a tradition that is thousands of years old, temporarily housed in the body, and the moment of 1943. This sounds eccentric. It is eccentric. It is also, in a specific and useful way, functional. Because a man who believes he is the continuation of a warrior tradition stretching back to antiquity does not suffer from the particular modern anxiety of wondering whether he is adequate to the moment. He already knows. He has always known. The moment is his. He goes to West Point. He graduates in 1909, which puts him a class ahead of Eisenhower, and the two men's paths will cross and recross for the rest of their careers, in a relationship that is warm, complicated, occasionally tense, and ultimately one of the most consequential military partnerships of the Second World War. At West Point, Patton is not a distinguished student academically. He is distinguished in other ways. He is obsessive about military history, reading Caesar and Napoleon and Frederick the Great, not as historical curiosities, but as operational manuals, mining them for tactical lessons applicable to the present. He is a superb athlete. He competes in the modern pentathlon at the 1912 Stockholm Olympics, finishing 5th overall and, controversially, placing 3rd in the pistol shooting component, which he always believed should have ranked him higher. He designs his own sword, not for fun. He designs an actual cavalry sword that is adopted by the U.S. Army in 1913 and is known, briefly, as the Patton Sabre. He is 27 years old. In the First World War, Patton commands the 1st American tank unit in combat history. He is wounded leading his men on foot during the Meuse-Argonne offensive. He has gotten out of his tank because the tank has stalled, which tells you everything about the specific quality of his personal courage and his relationship with caution. He is wounded by machine gun fire. He lies in a shell crater for over an hour, directing the battle before being evacuated. He is 33 years old. He has already done more than most men do in a lifetime, and he is, by any reasonable measure, just getting started. Between the wars, Patton studies. He reads voraciously military history, philosophy, poetry, the Bible, which he knows in extraordinary detail and quotes from with a frequency that surprises people who only know the version of Patton that is profane and violent and theatrical. He writes papers and articles about armored warfare. He argues, sometimes against considerable institutional resistance, that the tank is not a support weapon for infantry, but an offensive arm in its own right, that the future of warfare belongs to speed and shock and the exploitation of the enemy's confusion, not to the grinding attrition of the First World War. He is, in this, absolutely correct. And this is where the Patton of legend and the Patton of reality are, for once, perfectly aligned. Because whatever else Patton is, and he is many things, not all of them admirable, and we will not pretend otherwise, he is, as a practitioner of armored warfare, a genuine genius. Not in the intuitive, improvisational way that Rommel is a genius. Patton's genius is more studied, more deliberate, more conscious of its own foundations. He has read everything. He has thought about everything. And he has a quality of mind that can hold all of that reading and thinking and analysis and then, in the chaos of a real battle, access exactly the right piece of it at exactly the right moment. He also has something that is rarer than tactical brilliance and arguably more important for what he is about to do in Tunisia. He understands soldiers, not abstractly, not theoretically. He understands them the way a great coach understands athletes, with an almost physical intuition for what they need, what they can give, what is holding them back, and how to reach them. He understands that soldiers fight not for abstract causes, but for specific, concrete, immediate things. For the man next to them, for pride, unit pride, personal pride, the pride that comes from being told, credibly, that you are the best, and then being made to act like it. For fear of letting someone down who they respect. Patton knows how to make soldiers respect him, and he knows how to make them afraid of letting him down. This is what he brings to Tunisia. He takes command of 2nd Corps on March 6, 1943. Within 24 hours, the headquarters has been reorganized. Vehicles are properly camouflaged. Sentries are posting correctly. The informal, we're all just doing our best atmosphere that has developed over months of demoralization is gone, replaced by something that several officers in their diaries describe with variations on the same word. Fear. Not of the enemy, of Patton. He issues an order, and this order becomes somewhat famous, and is sometimes mocked, and was certainly mocked at the time, that all soldiers in the forward areas must wear their helmets and their neckties at all times. Neckties. In the Tunisian desert, with the temperature climbing toward 100 degrees. Soldiers complain about this. Of course they complain about this. They complain loudly and creatively, with the particular inventiveness that American soldiers bring to profanity when they feel the situation demands it. Patton knows they're complaining. He doesn't care. Or more precisely, he cares, and he is counting on it. Because here is what the necktie order actually is. It is not about neckties. It is about the establishment of a simple, inescapable principle. In George Patton's army, You will do what you are told, when you are told, to the standard that is demanded, without exception and without negotiation. Not because the thing you are being told to do makes obvious sense, because you have been told to do it by someone who has made clear he is serious. The necktie is a test, and every soldier who ties the necktie and puts on the helmet grumbling, furious, sweating in the desert heat has just passed the test, not a test of compliance. A test of whether an institutional culture has been established in which orders are followed. Omar Bradley, who serves under Patton in Tunisia and writes about it in his memoirs, with his characteristic combination of admiration and exasperation, puts it this way. Patton believed that an army that would follow orders about neckties would follow orders about attacking. He was right. The fines begin almost immediately. Patton drives through the Corps area personally, in his jeep, unannounced, and stops soldiers who are out of uniform. He finds them on the spot. $25 for no helmet, $50 for no necktie. The amounts are significant. A private in 1943 earns $50 a month. Patton takes the money and donates it to the unit fund. He also does something that surprises the officers who are expecting a commanding general to command from a command post. He goes forward, constantly, persistently, with a disregard for his own personal safety that his staff finds genuinely alarming, and that his superiors, including Eisenhower, occasionally and ineffectually attempt to curtail. He goes to the front lines. He talks to the soldiers there. He looks at their positions, their equipment, their faces. He identifies problems and addresses them on the spot, sometimes gently, sometimes not, in the particular language of a man for whom profanity is not an emotional release, but a precision instrument. There is a story probably apocryphal in its specific details, but entirely true in its essence, about Patton stopping a column of American trucks that has stalled on a road under enemy observation. The drivers have gotten out of their vehicles and are standing around waiting for someone to tell them what to do. Patton arrives in his jeep, assesses the situation in about 15 seconds, and proceeds to personally direct traffic for the next 20 minutes, standing in the middle of the road, under intermittent shell fire, until the column is moving again. Then he gets back in his jeep and drives off. The soldiers who witness this do not forget it. An army that watches its commanding general stand in the road under shell fire calmly, authoritatively, doing the most mundane possible thing, waving vehicles through an intersection, has received a message that no speech could deliver as effectively. He is not asking them to do anything he won't do himself. The transformation of two corps under Patton happens faster than anyone who wasn't there would believe. Not because Patton is magic, not because he does anything that is, in isolation, extraordinary. The training is not dramatically different from what came before. The equipment is the same. The soldiers are the same soldiers who were retreating through Kasserine 3 weeks ago. But something has changed. Something fundamental. Something that lives in the institution rather than the individual. The soldiers of two corps begin, slowly and then rapidly, to believe in themselves again. Not because Patton tells them to, he doesn't. Exactly. Not in those terms. He tells them they are the best soldiers in the world, and that he expects them to act like it, which is slightly different. He tells them that Kasserine happened because their previous commanders failed them, not because they were inadequate. He tells them what he is going to do, and then he does it, which builds a specific kind of trust that cannot be manufactured through speeches alone. By mid-March, Second Corps is ready to fight again, and fight it does. The Battle of El Alamein, March 23, 1943. This is Patton's first major engagement as Second Corps commander, and it is the first clear-cut American victory against the German army in World War II. The 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One of the most storied units in American military history, digs in at El Alamein and waits for the German 10th Panzer Division to attack. This is a reversal of what has been happening for months. The Americans are not advancing into the German guns. They are drawing the Germans forward into their own prepared positions, a lesson learned, directly and specifically, from watching Rommel do exactly this to the British for 2 years. The 10th Panzer attacks at dawn. It advances into a carefully prepared kill zone of artillery, tank destroyers, and infantry that tears it apart. By the end of the day, the Germans have lost over 30 tanks and hundreds of men. The Americans hold the position. It is not a perfect victory. There are mistakes. There are moments when units don't coordinate as well as they should, when communications break down, when the exhaustion of sustained combat shows. But the line holds. The Americans fight. And when the Germans disengage, they do not do so because the Americans broke. They do so because the Americans did not break. This matters beyond the tactical result. It matters because every man in 2 Corps, every man who went forward at El Ghoutar instead of back, who stood in the artillery storm and stayed, who fired his weapon at an advancing German tank and kept firing every one of those men, has just learned something about himself that no training and no speech could teach him. He can do this. He can stand up in the worst thing he has ever experienced, and he can fight. He is not the soldier who ran at Kasserine, or, if he is that soldier, he is also now this soldier, and this one is stronger. Patton himself is, during these weeks, operating at a pitch of intensity that his aides find alarming and his enemies find baffling. He sleeps 4 or 5 hours a night. He is everywhere: the front, the headquarters, the supply depots, the hospitals. He visits the wounded. He pins medals on men who have distinguished themselves. He also, notoriously, twice visits field hospitals and slaps soldiers whom he accuses of cowardice incidents that will nearly end his career later in Sicily and that reveal, with uncomfortable clarity, the sharp edge of the psychology that makes him effective. The same engine that drives his intensity and his courage and his extraordinary willingness to push himself and his men toward the limit runs very close to something less admirable: a ruthlessness, an inability to extend to others the same compassionate understanding of human limits that, ironically, makes him so effective as a trainer and as a leader. But that reckoning comes later. In Tunisia, in the spring of 1943, Patton is what the moment requires. And the moment requires someone who can take a broken institution and make it believe in itself again. Someone who can look at an army that has been defeated and say, not with false optimism, not with the bright cheerfulness of someone who doesn't understand what defeat costs, but with the cold certainty of someone who has studied war for 40 years, that defeat is not destiny. He says it in many ways, in many speeches, in many individual conversations with officers and enlisted men across the length and breadth of Second Corps. But the version I keep coming back to, the one that seems to me to contain the most truth, is the simplest. He says, "No bastard ever won a war by dying for his country. He won it by making the other poor dumb bastard die for his country." It is profane. It is theatrical. It is also, as a statement of military philosophy, completely and exactly correct. By April 1943, the shape of the North African campaign is becoming clear. Rommel, his health finally broken beyond his ability to ignore it, has left North Africa. Hitler has recalled him ostensibly for medical treatment, functionally because the situation in Tunisia is deteriorating, and Hitler does not want to lose his most celebrated general in a surrender. Rommel leaves in March, handing command to General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim. He never returns to Africa. He leaves behind the legend, the Afrika Korps, and a strategic situation that is increasingly, irreversibly hopeless. In the east, Montgomery's 8th Army is pressing forward from El Alamein, a long, methodical, overwhelming push that has driven the remnants of the Afrika Korps back across the width of Libya and into Tunisia. Montgomery is not fast. He is never fast. His critics, of whom there are many, and who include, at various points, almost every American general he encounters, find his caution maddening. But he is relentless, and he is careful with his men's lives in a way that the soldiers who serve under him appreciate, in the particular, quiet way that soldiers appreciate a commander who does not spend them carelessly. From the west, Patton's II Corps is pushing east, engaging German forces, tightening the ring. In the north, British and French forces are doing the same. The Axis forces in Tunisia are being compressed into an ever-shrinking perimeter. Their supply lines across the Mediterranean have been cut almost completely by Allied air and naval power. They are running out of fuel, ammunition, food, medical supplies. The soldiers of the Afrika Korps, some of the most experienced, most professional soldiers in the German army, men who have been fighting in this desert for 2 and 3 years, are hungry and exhausted and holding positions they know they cannot hold forever. May 1943. The end is coming, and when it comes fast. On May 13th, 1943, the last organized Axis resistance in North Africa collapses. 275,000 German and Italian soldiers surrender. It is, as I mentioned at the beginning of tonight's story, a number that should stop you cold, larger than Stalingrad. The largest single surrender of Axis forces in the entire European war. The Afrika Korps, Rommel's beloved Afrika Korps, the instrument of so much brilliance and suffering and sacrifice, ceases to exist as a fighting force. At II Corps headquarters, Patton receives the news. He is already gone, actually transferred to plan the Sicily invasion. His work in Tunisia handed to Omar Bradley, who will prove to be an excellent corps commander in his own methodical, unflamboyant, deeply competent way. But the news reaches Patton, and those who are with him say that he is, for a moment, very quiet. Not sad, not triumphant, quiet. He has spent 40 years preparing for this. He has read every battle, studied every commander, worn the uniform through peacetime after peacetime, while the wars he was built for failed to materialize. And now he is here, in the war, doing what he was made to do. What he says, in that quiet moment, is not recorded. But Omar Bradley, who knows him better than almost anyone by this point, says later that he thinks he understands what Patton was feeling in moments like that. Not satisfaction, exactly, not pride. Something simpler than that. Something more fundamental, purpose, the sense of a man who has finally arrived at the place he was always traveling toward. The desert campaign is over, but the war is not. Sicily is waiting. Italy is waiting. And beyond Italy, though no one will say it out loud quite yet, something enormous is being planned. Something so vast and so consequential that the entire North African campaign, all the battles, all the sacrifice, all the learning and the dying and the slow, painful transformation of the American army from what it was to what it needed to become will turn out to have been the prologue. Patton doesn't know what that thing is called yet, but he knows it's coming. He can feel it. He goes back to work. Chapter 7. El Alamein to the End. There is a moment in Bernard Montgomery's memoirs where he describes the night before the Battle of El Alamein begins. It is October 23rd, 1942. In a few hours, over 1,000 British guns will open fire simultaneously along a 40-mile front, and 200,000 men will begin moving forward into the most heavily mined battlefield in the history of warfare. The fate of Egypt, the Suez Canal, the entire Middle Eastern theater, and arguably the broader trajectory of the war depends on what happens in the next 2 weeks. Montgomery goes to bed at 9:30. He sleeps soundly. He includes this detail in his memoirs, not as an aside, not apologetically, but as a point of pride. As a demonstration of a principle he has held throughout his military career and has made the cornerstone of his command philosophy in the desert. A commander, he writes, must be so thoroughly prepared, so completely confident in his plan and his preparations, that by the time the battle begins, there is nothing left for anxiety to attach to. Everything that can be done has been done. The plan is made. The men are briefed. The supplies are positioned. Sleep is not indulgence. Sleep is evidence that you have done your job. This is Montgomery. This is the man who is, in the autumn of 1942, the other half of the equation. The man the Allies have placed on the eastern end of the North African theater to do what no British general has yet managed to do. Stop Rommel, permanently. Bernard Montgomery is, by any measure, a difficult human being. He is vain. He is self-promoting to a degree that his colleagues find exhausting and his superiors find infuriating. He is dismissive of Americans consistently, openly, with a confidence in British military superiority that the events of the war do not entirely support, and that causes a level of friction with his Allied counterparts, that is, at various points, genuinely dangerous to the coalition. He is not warm. He does not inspire the kind of instinctive personal loyalty that Patton generates. The soldiers who serve under him do not love him the way Patton's soldiers love Patton, but they trust him. And in the autumn of 1942, after 3 years of war that have included Dunkirk and Singapore and Tobruk and a dozen lesser disasters, trust is worth more than love. Montgomery is born in 1887, the son of a Church of England bishop, and his childhood is not a happy one. His mother is cold and distant, he describes their relationship. In later life, with a flatness that speaks of wounds still present, he finds in the army what he never found at home: a structure, a clarity, a set of rules that are comprehensible, and a hierarchy in which advancement is possible through merit and effort rather than affection. He is, from the beginning, ferociously professional. Wounded severely in the First World War, shot through the lung by a sniper, left for dead, surviving through luck and the bravery of a soldier who carried him to safety under fire, he emerges from the experience with an obsession about the relationship between commanders and the men they command. He has seen too many soldiers die for plans that were inadequate, led by officers who were comfortable in headquarters and uncomfortable at the front. He will not be that kind of officer. He will know his men. He will visit them. He will make certain that every soldier in his command, from the most senior general to the most junior private, understands what they are doing and why. This commitment to what he calls the human element of command turns out to be his greatest strength. And El Alamein is where it pays off most completely. When Montgomery takes command of the British 8th Army in August 1942, the army he inherits is not broken, but it is badly bent. The retreats, the reverses, the grinding back and forth of the Desert Campaign have produced in the 8th Army a kind of institutional caution, a hesitancy, a tendency to expect things to go wrong, that manifests in planning that is too conservative, and execution that lacks the final push needed to turn tactical success into strategic victory. The Army has beaten Rommel before, tactically. It has never been able to finish him. Montgomery changes this, but not by being bolder. He changes it by being more thorough. He inspects every unit. He talks to every senior commander. He makes changes, some significant, some symbolic, all of them deliberate messages about what kind of army the 8th Army is going to become. He bans the word withdrawal from planning documents. Not because withdrawal is never tactically sound, it sometimes is, but because the word has acquired, in the 8th Army's vocabulary, a psychological weight that goes beyond its tactical meaning. It has come to represent an expectation of failure. He removes that word, and with it, as much as he can manage, that expectation. He also does something that seems, on the surface, like pure theater, but is in fact deeply calculated. He gets a hat. Specifically, he acquires a black beret from an Australian tank unit and adds the badges of the Royal Tank Regiment and the General Officer. He wears it everywhere. He visits units in it. He appears in newsreel footage in it. It becomes, within weeks, one of the most recognizable items of kit in the British Army. The hat is not vanity, or not only vanity, it is a visibility strategy. Montgomery understands with a clarity unusual for senior commanders of his generation that soldiers need to see their commander, not in photographs, not in dispatches, with their eyes, in person, close enough to observe that he is real and present, and not afraid. The hat makes him instantly recognizable from a distance. When soldiers see the black beret moving through their position, they know exactly who it is. They see him, he sees them. The transaction is simple and, Montgomery has calculated, powerful. He is right. The plan for El Alamein Operation Lightfoot, followed by the decisive phase, Operation Supercharge is, like Montgomery himself, methodical to the point of seeming mechanical. He has advantages that no British commander in the desert has previously enjoyed. Ultra-intelligence, the decoded German enigma, signals that give the Allies an extraordinary window into Axis communications and intentions. Air superiority, finally, after 2 years of roughly equal air power over the desert, and material superiority of a kind that Rommel, with his perpetually strangled supply lines, simply cannot match. By October 1942, the 8th Army has over 1,000 tanks. Rommel has 500, and a significant portion of them are Italian vehicles of questionable quality. The 8th Army has overwhelming artillery. It has been reinforced with American equipment, including the Sherman tank, which is arriving in quantity and which is, unlike some of its predecessors, a machine that can fight German armor on something approaching equal terms. Montgomery's plan is simple in concept. Break through the northern sector of the Axis line at night, using sappers to clear lanes through the minefields, pass armor through the gaps. Then, when Rommel counterattacks as he always does, as he cannot help doing, destroy the counterattack with the prepared anti-tank screen, repeat until the Axis line collapses. It is not elegant in the Rommel sense. It is a siege, a methodical, grinding, overwhelming application of superior force, designed not to outmaneuver the enemy, but to grind him down until he cannot fight anymore. Rommel himself, studying the plan afterward, acknowledges its effectiveness with the particular sourness of a man who has been beaten by something he doesn't entirely respect. He writes that Montgomery is not a bold commander. He is, however, a competent one. And competence, Rommel notes, in a passage that says more about his situation than he probably intends, is sometimes enough. October 23rd, 1942, 9:30 p.m. Montgomery is asleep. At 10 p.m., 882 guns open fire simultaneously along the front. The barrage lasts 5 hours. The noise is audible in Alexandria, 60 miles away. The ground shakes. In the German and Italian positions, men who survive it describe the experience in terms that consistently reach for the same images: earthquake, the end of the world, something outside the vocabulary of human experience. The infantry advances behind the barrage. The sappers move forward into the minefields, men with detectors and probes, working by hand in the dark, marking lanes with tape and lights, under fire, doing some of the most terrifying work of the entire campaign, with a quietness and a professionalism that is never adequately celebrated. The first night is brutal. The lanes through the minefields are narrower than planned. armor moves slowly, bunching up, presenting targets. German resistance is fierce. The defenders, many of them experienced soldiers, fight back with an effectiveness that surprises even Montgomery's optimistic projections. But they move forward, slowly, at enormous cost. But forward. Here is where Rommel's absence becomes critical. Rommel is not in North Africa when El Alamein begins. He is in Austria, in hospital, his health finally having demanded the treatment he has been denying it for months. His replacement, General Georg Stumme, has a heart attack and dies on the first day of the battle, the only German general in the Second World War to die of natural causes in the field, with a timing that is catastrophic for the Axis defense. Hitler calls Rommel. Rommel, still sick, still weak, gets out of his hospital bed and flies back to North Africa. He arrives on October 25th, 2 days into the battle, and the situation he finds is already worse than the reports have prepared him for. The Axis line is under enormous pressure. Ammunition is critically short. Fuel always. The fuel is running out. He calculates that he has enough petrol for 3 days of mobile operations. After that, his armor will be stationary. And stationary armor against an enemy with the material superiority Montgomery possesses is not armor at all. He attacks anyway. Of course he attacks. It is what he does. The counterattacks come in waves, fierce, desperate, some of them making temporary gains before being beaten back by the combination of British armor and, critically, the air power that hammers the German formations continuously, destroying fuel trucks and ammunition convoys and command vehicles, making every movement costly. The 88s are there. The tactical skill is there. The courage is there. What is not there is enough of anything else. November 2nd, 1942. Montgomery launches Operation Supercharge, the final breakthrough attempt, a concentrated assault through the northern sector of the Axis line with everything he has. Rommel throws his remaining armor into a desperate counterattack. The British armor absorbs it. The 88s fire until there is no more ammunition for the 88s. German tank commanders report their fuel gauges touching empty. The line breaks. In the early hours of November 4th, Rommel sends a message to his corps commanders. The word he uses in German is Ausweichen, evasion, retreat. He orders the withdrawal. He also sends a message to Hitler, requesting permission to retreat. Hitler's response arrives hours later. Hold your ground. Fight to the last man. Victory or death. Rommel reads this message. He is 50 years old, sick, exhausted, watching an army he has built and loved being destroyed around him. He reads the message from his commander, ordering him to die in place. He ignores it. He retreats. This is, I think, one of the more remarkable moments in the entire campaign, because Rommel, whatever his other complexities and contradictions, is at this moment choosing the lives of his men over the orders of his government. He knows what Hitler's message means. He knows that ignoring a direct Führer order is not a small thing. He ignores it anyway. The retreat westward across Libya begins, 1,000 miles. Past Benghazi, past Tripoli, all the way back toward Tunisia and the defensive lines where, ultimately, the Afrika Korps will make its last stand. Montgomery does not pursue as aggressively as Rommel fears he might. This is the great criticism of El Alamein, not that it was won, but that the victory was not fully exploited, that Rommel was allowed to escape to fight another day. The criticism is not entirely fair. Montgomery's supply situation is also stressed, and a defeated army retreating across open desert is not as vulnerable as it looks on a map, but it is not entirely unfair either. The desert fox escapes. But he escapes with a broken army, and he knows it. There is a letter Rommel writes to Lucy during the retreat. It is November, and the weather has turned cold at night. Rain that turns the desert roads to mud. The Afrika Korps is moving west in a long, exhausted column, harried by British air power, short of everything, conducting what Rommel describes with a kind of terrible precision as an orderly withdrawal under conditions that are designed to prevent orderly withdrawal. He writes, "I have been thinking a great deal about what we are fighting for and whether it can be achieved. I do not know. I find myself very tired." It is, perhaps, the most human thing he writes in the entire corpus of his desert correspondence. Not the tactics, not the operational analysis, not the complaints about supply and the frustration with Rome and Berlin. This, I do not know. I find myself very tired. The fox, for the first time, sounds like a man. The final act in North Africa plays out through the winter of 1942 and the spring of 1943, with the Axis forces compressed into an ever smaller perimeter in Tunisia. We have already seen pieces of this from the American side: the disaster at Kasserine, the arrival of Patton, the transformation of two corps. Now let's see the full picture. From the east, Montgomery's 8th Army moves methodically up through Libya and into Tunisia, pushing the retreating Axis forces before it. The advance is slow by Rommel's standards. Montgomery refuses to be hurried, refuses to overextend, refuses to give the enemy any opportunity for the kind of devastating counterattack that has punished previous British advances. He is criticized for this relentlessness by generals who want more speed. He ignores the criticism. From the west, the Americans under Patton and then Bradley push east. From the north, British and French forces press south. The ring closes. Rommel, in February 1943, has one last moment of brilliance: the attack at Kasserine, that we have already lived through in detail, followed by another attack, the Battle of El Alamein, directed at Montgomery's positions in the south. This attack fails completely. Montgomery, warned by ultra-intelligence of its exact timing and direction, has prepared his defenses with precision. The attacking German armor drives into a screen of anti-tank guns so carefully positioned and so well supplied with ammunition that the battle is over almost before it begins. 52 German tanks are destroyed. The British lose no armor at all. Rommel calls it the death blow for the army in Africa. He is right. He also calls it his worst defeat of the entire campaign. The man who built his legend on reading the enemy's intentions and acting before they can respond has finally encountered a commander who can read him in return. He flies out of Tunisia 2 weeks later. He never comes back. May 1943. The endgame. General von Arnim, commanding what remains of the Axis forces in Tunisia, does what professional soldiers do when the situation is genuinely hopeless. He assesses it with clear eyes, accepts what cannot be changed, and focuses on what can. What can be done is to make the final resistance cost the Allies as much as possible, to delay as long as possible, to give the German High Command time for what, exactly, becomes less clear with every passing day. There is no relief force coming. The Luftwaffe can barely get supply aircraft through the Allied air screen. The sea routes are cut. There is no exit. On May 13th, 1943, von Arnim surrenders. With him, 275,000 Axis soldiers lay down their arms. The moment is marked in different ways by different people. Montgomery, in his headquarters, notes it in his diary with characteristic concision. The campaign in Africa is over. He then turns his attention to the planning for Sicily, which is already underway. In Washington, Winston Churchill is addressing a joint session of Congress. The news arrives during his speech. He pauses. He lets the moment be felt. Then he continues. In Tunisia, the soldiers of two corps, the men who retreated through Kasserine, who tied their neckties in the desert heat, who stood at El Getar and did not break these men. Look at the columns of German prisoners moving past them on the roads, and feel something that is complicated in the way that important things always are. It is not simple triumph. It is not satisfaction, exactly. It contains relief and exhaustion, and a specific sadness for the men who are not there to see it. And somewhere underneath all of that, quiet and solid and new, the knowledge of something that was not known before. They can do this. They have done this. Whatever comes next, and they know something is coming, can see the preparations accumulating around them. The ships, the landing craft, the new equipment, whatever comes next. They are not the army that ran at Kasserine. They will never be that army again. 2 months later, on the night of July 9th, 1943, a young paratrooper sergeant from Tennessee falls out of the sky, over Sicily in the dark, lands on the wrong ground, finds himself alone behind enemy lines with a rifle and a compass, and the specific calm that has replaced, in men who have come this far, the fear that used to live there. He breathes. 4 counts in, 4 counts out. He figures out where he is. He goes to work. The tide is rising. Chapter 8. The Rising Tide. On the morning of July 10th, 1943, the largest amphibious invasion in history to that point touches the shores of Sicily. 160,000 men, 3,000 ships, 4,000 aircraft. A force so large that the convoys, assembling in the waters south of Malta, are visible from the island's highest points, an armada stretching to the horizon in every direction, moving north through the night, carrying with it everything that the previous 2 years of blood and failure and slow, painful learning have produced. This is Operation Husky, and if you want to understand what North Africa actually meant, what it was actually for, beyond the territory gained and the prisoners taken and the names on the casualty lists, this is the place to look. Because the army that lands on Sicily on July 10th, 1943, is not the army that stumbled ashore in Morocco and Algeria 8 months earlier. It looks the same from the outside. Same uniforms, same equipment, same faces, though many of the faces are different now, replacements for men who did not make it this far. But inside, at the level of institutional knowledge and collective experience and the deep cellular confidence that can only come from having been tested and having survived the test, it is a fundamentally different organism. North Africa made it, the desert made it, the defeats and the retreats, and the long, grinding process of learning how to fight a war made it. And now it is about to show what it has learned. The Sicily campaign lasts 38 days, July 10th to August 17th, 1943. In those 38 days, the Allies fight their way across an island that is mountainous and hot and defended with a combination of German professionalism and Italian unpredictability that makes every mile costly. The terrain, the volcanic rock of the interior, the narrow coastal roads, the towns built into the sides of cliffs in ways that make them natural fortresses, is as difficult as anything the army has faced. And yet, the difference in performance is visible from the first day. The landings, despite the navigational difficulties we have already followed through Jesse Adams's eyes, despite the wind and the scattered paratroopers and the inevitable chaos of any amphibious operation at this scale, succeed with a decisiveness that surprises even the planners who designed them. The beach defenses are overcome. The inland push begins. Units that would have stalled and waited for orders in Tunisia keep moving. Commanders making decisions at their level rather than passing everything up the chain, the kind of decentralized initiative that takes years of combat experience to develop functioning reliably. There are still mistakes. There are still moments of confusion, of poor coordination, of the particular friction that Clausewitz identified as the defining quality of warfare, the way that simple things become difficult and difficult things become impossible, and yet somehow the operation continues anyway. But the mistakes are smaller. The recovery from mistakes is faster. The institutional immune system that the Army has developed over 2 years of hard experience is working. There is another story playing out in Sicily that runs parallel to the military campaign, and it involves a competition so petty and so consequential simultaneously that it becomes one of the more remarkable subplots of the entire war. Patton and Montgomery are racing for Messina. Messina is the port city on the northeastern tip of Sicily, separated from the Italian mainland by a strait barely 2 miles wide. Whoever reaches Messina first effectively ends the campaign, cuts off the Axis escape route to Italy, traps whatever enemy forces remain on the island. Montgomery's original plan has the 8th Army taking the main road north along Sicily's eastern coast, through Catania to Messina. The Americans are assigned the secondary role protecting the British left flank, moving through the center and west of the island. Patton reads this plan, and his reaction is immediate, visceral, and entirely predictable to anyone who knows him. He decides to win the race, without explicit authorization, moving faster than the formal command structure can keep up with, exploiting every ambiguity in his orders and inventing a few new ones. He turns his 7th Army north and then east, driving across the top of the island toward Messina by a different route than anyone has planned for. He uses amphibious end runs, landing troops ahead of the retreating Germans on the coastal road to maintain the momentum. He drives his men at a pace that leaves his staff breathless and his supply officers gray with anxiety. He is doing what he has always done, what Rommel did, what every great offensive commander does when the opportunity appears. He is moving faster than the situation says he should be able to move. Montgomery, finding his eastern coastal route blocked by stubborn German resistance around Catania, is forced to reroute, sending units west onto the very roads that were supposed to be Patton's. This produces a confrontation between the two commanders that becomes briefly, explosively personal before Harold Alexander sorts it out with the diplomatic skill of a man who has been managing difficult personalities his entire career. Patton wins the race. American troops enter Messina on August 17th, a few hours before the British arrive. The victory is real and somewhat hollow simultaneously, because the Germans, in a masterpiece of organized military extraction, have evacuated the bulk of their forces across the strait to the Italian mainland before Messina falls 40,000 German soldiers, most of their equipment, most of their vehicles, crossing in the nights before the city falls under a very good Allied air umbrella that somehow, controversially, fails to stop them. The island is taken. The enemy's main force escapes. It is a pattern that will repeat itself in Italy. Brilliant tactical success, producing strategic outcomes that fall short of what might have been achieved with different decisions at the operational level. These are the things that military historians argue about at conferences. The soldiers who fought there are mostly just glad to have survived it. Italy comes next. And Italy is its own story, a long, grinding, costly campaign up the spine of a peninsula that is perfectly designed by geography to be defended, that costs the Allies 2 brutal years of fighting, from September 1943 to May 1945, that produces heroism and atrocity and political complexity and some of the most savage small unit fighting of the entire war. The invasion at Salerno in September 1943, Operation Avalanche, Mark Clark's moment, nearly fails. The Germans, now fully committed to defending Italy rather than evacuating it, counterattack the Salerno beachhead with a ferocity that at one point has Clark considering re-embarkation. The situation is saved by naval gunfire, by Allied air power, and by the refusal of the soldiers on the beach to be pushed back into the sea. They have been through too much to go back now. Rome falls in June 1944, the day before D-Day, which means that one of the great symbolic moments of the Italian campaign is almost immediately swallowed by the larger event. Soldiers who have fought their way to Rome through 2 years of Italian mud and mountains turn on their radios and hear about Normandy, and some of them, honestly, feel a complicated mixture of pride and something else. The sense that the story they have been part of a long, costly, important story is being folded into an even larger one, and that the accounting for what they gave may take longer to complete than any of them will live to see. But before all of that, before Salerno, before Rome, before the long Italian winter and the horror of Monte Cassino and all the rest of it, there is a moment I want to give you. It is the evening of August 17th, 1943. Messina has fallen. Sicily is secured. The North African and Sicilian campaigns, this long initial chapter of the war in the European theater, are over. Somewhere on the island, in a field hospital, a young American soldier is being treated for a shrapnel wound in his left arm. The wound is not serious. He will be back with his unit within 2 weeks. He lies on a cot and looks at the canvas ceiling of the tent and listens to the sounds of the army around him, the trucks, the voices, the distant sound of aircraft, the particular hum of a large military organization at rest between operations. He thinks about Georgia, about his mother's kitchen, about the smell of a peach pie in the oven, which is a smell so specific and so warm that it becomes, out here, a kind of physical ache. He thinks about a tank named Geraldine and one man climbing out of a hatch in the smoke at Sidi Bouzid, just one, and walking away. He thinks about Briggs, his sergeant, who is still alive and who said, "Let's go see what all the fuss is about on Valentine's Day morning," in a voice so completely ordinary that it has become, in Jack Logan's memory, one of the most remarkable things he has ever heard. He thinks about the men who are not here, their names, their faces, the particular way each of them was an individual human being, with a family somewhere and a future somewhere that did not arrive. He does not feel like a hero. He feels like a 23-year-old boy from Georgia who has been in Africa and then Sicily for 8 months, and who is very tired and who would like, very much, to go home. But he also feels something else, something that is harder to name, that lives underneath the tiredness and the grief and the homesickness like bedrock beneath soil. He has done this. Whatever this is, whatever it meant and will mean when history gets around to deciding, he was here. He did not turn away. When the moment came, the real moment, the moment without any theater or romance or distance, he did what was asked of him. That is enough. It has to be enough. It is, he thinks, more than enough. Now, let's come home, because this is where the story meets you. Right here, tonight, wherever you are listening from. You told me your city. Some of you are in places that were touched by this war directly, cities that were bombed, coastlines that were fought over, countries that were occupied and liberated and occupied again. Some of you are in places that sent men and women to fight in it. Some of you are generations removed from it, living in a world whose shape was determined by what happened in that desert, on those beaches, in those mountains, and who may never have thought very much about where that shape came from. I want to think about that with you for a few minutes. The North African campaign is often called the Forgotten War, and there is truth in that. When people think about World War II, they think about Normandy, about the Pacific, about the Holocaust, about Berlin. North Africa sits in the gaps between those larger memories too important to be a footnote, not dramatic enough, apparently, to claim its full share of the collective memory. But here is what I keep coming back to when I think about why this story matters. It is not, at its heart, a story about war. It is a story about failure. And what you do with it. The American army that arrives in North Africa in November 1942 is an institution that believes in itself without having earned that belief in the only way that counts through experience. It is confident in its equipment, its training, its doctrine. It is confident in the abstract proposition that it is the best. And then it encounters Rommel, who has been doing this for 3 years, and the confidence turns out to be a kind of elaborate fiction. Not a lie. The men who hold it believe it completely, but a fiction nonetheless, because it has not been tested, and therefore cannot really be known. Kasserine is the test, and Kasserine fails. And then, and here is the part that I find extraordinary, the part that seems to me to contain something genuinely worth carrying out of this story and into your own life. The institution looks at the failure directly, without flinching away. It identifies what went wrong and why. It removes the commanders who were inadequate. It changes the training, the tactics, the command culture. It brings in Patton, not because Patton is comfortable or easy or universally liked, but because the moment requires exactly what Patton is. And it goes back. There is a version of this story that is about American exceptionalism, the idea that the United States, given time and the right leadership, will always rise to meet any challenge, will always find the right man for the moment, will always overcome initial failure with ultimate triumph. I don't think that's quite right. Or, I don't think it's the most interesting thing about the story. The most interesting thing, to me, is not that America rose to the challenge, it is how. Not through some innate national quality, not through destiny or providence or the inevitable working out of historical forces, through specific choices made by specific people, some of whom were great, and some of whom were deeply flawed, and most of whom were simply human beings doing the best they could with what they had in circumstances that nobody had asked them to be in. Eisenhower chose to keep learning when he could have hidden behind his rank. Patton chose to go to the front when he could have stayed in his headquarters. The tank crews chose to climb back into their tanks after Kasserine when nobody would have thought less of them for being afraid. The paratroopers chose to move toward the fighting even when they were lost and alone, and the plan had come apart around them. None of these choices were inevitable. Each of them was real. Each of them cost something. Bernard Montgomery, for all his considerable flaws, says something in his memoirs that I have thought about a great deal in the time I have spent with this story. He writes about what he believes the essential quality of a commander must be. Not intelligence, he says. Not courage, though courage matters. Not even experience, though experience is irreplaceable. The essential quality, he writes, is this: the ability to create, in the minds of the men you lead, the certainty that whatever happens, it will be all right. Not the false certainty of someone who pretends the danger is not real. Not the performed confidence of theater. The real certainty, the kind that comes from preparation so thorough that when the unexpected happens, which it always does, the foundation is solid enough to absorb it. I think about this in contexts far beyond the military. How many of the situations that feel most overwhelming in our own lives are overwhelming precisely because we have not built the foundation? Because we have relied on the fiction of confidence rather than doing the work of earning it? Because we have convinced ourselves that we are ready for something we have never actually tested? The desert strips away the fiction. The desert does not care what you believe about yourself. It cares only about what you actually do when the shooting starts. Erwin Rommel is buried in Herlingen, Germany, near his home. His grave is simple. There is a headstone. Visitors leave things there, sometimes photographs, letters, small tokens. Many of them are soldiers, or the children and grandchildren of soldiers from countries that fought against him. They come because the story of the Desert War is, among the people who know it well, a story that transcends the national affiliations of those who fought it. Rommel was not a good man in every sense. He served a regime that was evil, and he served it with his full professional capability for most of the war, whatever private doubts he carried. History does not give us the luxury of clean ledgers, but he was a soldier, a real one, and in the desert, far from the worst of what the regime he served was doing in the occupied territories of Europe. He fought a war that was, by the terrible standards of that conflict, relatively clean. He treated prisoners well. He did not target civilians. He played by the rules of a game that, by 1942 and 1943, had largely abandoned rules everywhere else. His opponent, Bernard Montgomery, has this to say about him in his memoirs, years after the war. "I would not class Rommel as a great commander, but I would class him as a good one. And I would say that, of all the opponents I encountered, he was the most formidable and the most honorable." Coming from Montgomery, the first adjective is the higher praise. But I think the second one is the more important one: honorable. In a war that produced so much dishonor, so much that the mind refuses to fully hold, honorable. That is worth something. That is worth naming. Dwight Eisenhower, who spends the North African campaign learning the gap between what he thought command was and what command actually is, goes on to plan and execute Operation Overlord D-Day, the largest amphibious invasion in the history of the world. He becomes the supreme commander of Allied forces in Europe. He accepts the German surrender in 1945. He becomes the 34th President of the United States. In his memoirs, written long after the war, he says that of all the operations he commanded, North Africa is the one he thinks about most. Not because it was the most important, though it was important, but because it was the one where he learned the most, the one that cost him the most personally: the sleepless nights, the uncertainty, the weight of decisions made without adequate information by a man who was not yet certain he was up to the job. He says, "I was never sure, in North Africa, whether I was equal to what was being asked of me. I am still not entirely sure, but I know that the uncertainty forced me to work harder, to listen more carefully, to be slower to assume I was right, and faster to recognize when I was wrong. I became, in North Africa, a better commander than I had been before it. I became, I think, a better man." I believe him. George Patton is killed in a car accident in Germany on December 21st, 1945, 4 months after the war ends. He is 60 years old. He never gets to command in the Pacific, which he desperately wants. He never gets to fight the Soviet Union, which he believes is inevitable, and argues for with an indiscretion that causes his superiors considerable headaches in the final months of the war. He is buried at the Luxembourg American Cemetery with the men of the Third Army who fell in the Battle of the Bulge. He asked to be buried with his soldiers. Of course he did. His headstone gives his rank and his dates, nothing else. He would have wanted something more dramatic, probably. A quote from Caesar, perhaps, or from Napoleon. Something that captured the scale of the story he believed himself to be part of. But the simplicity is, I think, more true. A soldier among his soldiers. In the ground of a continent he helped to liberate. That is enough. It is, I think, more than enough. Tonight we have traveled a long way. From the rock floor of Gibraltar, where Eisenhower sat in a cave and waited for dawn, and the coin kept coming up heads or tails, and there was nothing to do but wait, to the Egyptian desert, where Rommel stood at the edge of what he knew, on the wrong side of El Alamein, and chose his men over his orders, to Kasserine Pass, where young men from Georgia and Pennsylvania and Tennessee discovered the distance between who they had believed themselves to be and who the war was going to require them to become. To the airspace above Sicily, where a sergeant from a small town fell through darkness toward a landing zone that wasn't there and breathed, 4 counts in, 4 counts out, and found the calm underneath the fear. These are not abstractions. These are people, real people, whose choices in extraordinary circumstances shaped the world you and I were born into. The roads we drive on, the institutions we inhabit, the specific configuration of nations and alliances and international structures that constitute the background radiation of our daily lives, all of it runs, in some traceable way, back through the Italian campaign and the Sicilian campaign and the North African campaign, back to El Alamein and Kasserine and the desert between them, back to the specific choices made by specific people in specific moments of extremity. We are, in ways both visible and invisible, the product of what they did. I want to leave you with one last image. It is May 1943, Tunisia, a road outside Tunis on a warm spring day. The olive trees are in bloom. The air smells of dust and flowers and, faintly, still, of smoke. Along the road, a column of German prisoners moves west. They are orderly, tired, professional even in defeat, the particular bearing of men who were well-trained and fought hard and lost, not because they were inadequate, but because the tide that came against them was, in the end, larger than anything any individual courage could have turned. On the other side of the road, American soldiers watch them pass. The Americans are young, most of them, barely old enough, many of them, to buy a drink back home. They are dirty and thin and carrying in their eyes the specific weight of everything the last 8 months have placed there. They watch the Germans pass. And then one of the American soldiers, nobody records who exactly, which is fitting, says something to the man next to him. The man next to him laughs. Then a few others laugh. A laugh that runs down the line, not cruel, not triumphant, just human. The laugh of people who have survived something together and are still, somehow, able to laugh. The Germans keep walking. The Americans keep watching. The olive trees move in the May wind. The tide has turned. It is still rising. And somewhere in the future, far beyond this road, beyond this war, beyond the half-century of consequences and reckonings that are still to come, you are listening. In your city, at your hour, in the life that this and 1,000 other moments made possible. The sand remembers everything. So should we. Good night.